Hey, man.
How's it going?
Good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, nice to take a break out of the week and speak to you.
I hope it's going to be a break and not like a slog or a marathon, but
I don't think so, man. I don't think so.
Well, we'll see. We'll see in a few hours. You have a very crisp video feed.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, it's just a sort of older webcam. But I flipped my room round so I get light from the window, and it kind of this time of day it looks good. As we go on, it may deteriorate due to the sun disappearing behind clouds, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's why I'm in a dark dungeon with a place to light in there.
Perfect.
Which camera is that? Because I'm supposed to be having a pretty decent webcam, but I mean this doesn't look as good.
So it's the old. I think it's a Logitech. I think it's like the C920 or something. It's one that it's really quite old. I remember getting it because it was one that sort of streamers were using a lot. Quite a few years ago now. I think maybe even 10 years ago. But it's just a reliable kind of thing. I feel like I'm jinxing it now, and it'll turn off mid-screen. But so far, it's been reliable and quite good.
Yeah, I should definitely look into my camera settings because this is like a pretty new Logitech. Right. Stuff to tweak on that front. But it's pretty tricky with the sensors because with the lighting, especially if it's like dim, they get super grainy. But
yeah, this one as well. So let's enjoy it while it has light.
While it lasts.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, thanks for doing this. You've basically in a very short time span become one of my favorite artists. I bumped into your music on Apple Music quite randomly, and it took me like a few seconds, and I thought, wow, this is really cool stuff. And that was the Nervous Test Pilot stuff. And yeah, I mean, it really spoke to me to like, it doesn't happen very often when you hear something and it really, first of all, blows you away. But also it's been like, I've had a few pretty rough months now, and your music has genuinely given me a lot of like relief and calm and hope. So first of all, I want to thank you for your music because it's done a lot for me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Genuinely, I know that sometimes when and you'll have this as well. I've heard your music sort of when you got in touch with me. I listened to some of your work, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. This is someone who is really accomplished and knows what they're doing, and wants to have a conversation about music potentially, and that's always great. But when someone gives you a compliment like you just have about your work, it's sort of easy to just go, oh, thank you very much, and kind of deflect that. But it genuinely does mean a lot to me. When so I'm just glad that something I made was able to be helpful to you in that way, and sort of thank you for expressing that so eloquently. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I don't usually, I honestly wouldn't have even said anything, but to me it has, like, your music has worked at a spiritual level for me, and it has, because I find that I don't really. You hear a lot of really good music and it gets you hyped up and you think, oh, this is really cool and awesome. But it's rare for music to like give you a sense of like deep meaning and hope and relief. So because of that, I thought because otherwise it can come across as a bit pretentious to say, oh, I love your music, and give this kind of a opening. But I thought I'd start with that because it's like, it's genuinely been like a spiritual thing for me to really like, because when I'm writing music, that's when I feel like I'm connected to like a transcendent force, for the lack of a better word. And in those moments, you feel completely at one with the universe or everything. And it's rare for someone else's music to kind of give you those same things. So I just wanted to touch on that because I'm genuinely grateful for that. And it's a powerful reminder for me as well that music has that power, because it's been a long while since like last time I heard something that did that for me. So I thought it would be important to mention that to you.
Well, that's wonderful, and I'm so grateful to you for expressing that, because there is no higher praise. You know, that's the goal when you are making something. Again, as you know, like the goal is to create that connection, and also that someone can, you know, listen to it and sort of go into that space where it's just sort of them and the music, and they can take what they want from that. So again, it's hugely generous of you to share that you had that experience, because for me, I'm just sitting here going like, you know, mission accomplished, right? Like that's sort of how I feel. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. No, you're very welcome. And it's with this podcast also, I'm trying to help people how to like turn this passion and this hobby into something, you know, professional, so that they can do nothing but that, professionally speaking. And it's easy to forget there is no, like you said, there's no bigger goal with art, with music, than to give people those deep emotional connections. And maybe because sometimes you forget that it's possible to give people hope and give them comfort and give them those kind of things through your music. So it's also a good reminder for me that, you know, it's not all about just trying to monetize what you do. But yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled, super excited for today, because I actually know very little about you. I obviously know the music you've done, and it's what people should know is that, okay, you have this you do music under Nervous Test Pilot, but you also do and Nervous Test Pilot, I think you describe as, is it electronica, or what's
I've kind of gone with electronica. Electronica was kind of a genre term that came about in kind of the early 2000s, which is a period I'm sure we're going to get to talking about, because that's a sort of foundational period of music for me, and sort of when I was growing up. So and then we got kind of into the whole EDM and there was IDM, you know, in the early 90s, sort of intelligent dance music. And electronica to me was like this quite nice umbrella thing that just was sort of about kind of celebrating a kind of panoply of electronic sounds and that sort of thing. So yeah, I kind of call that electronica, and that means, I think it means a different thing in the US. I kind of always did it kind of meant dance music there, but I mean it in that kind of sense. Yeah. So there's Nervous Test Pilot, which is that stuff. I would say that's kind of also broadened out a little bit. I would say I've sort of had I'm not trying to compare myself to him, but I've kind of had a Junkie XL type of thing where people know that name. So if I do a soundtrack or something, that it's sort of stretched the meaning of that name. And I'm always very grateful to people who follow that, because they'll certainly go on a journey kind of listening to some of the different stuff I've done under that name. So the people I really kind of, you know, I'm rooting for the most are listeners who can cope with all of my different stuff under that name. So I have that, and then I have a couple of other projects as well. There's Snare, which is kind of chiptune influenced. And we can talk about that as well. And that was something I needed to put somewhere else, because it was so different. I saw a comment once, which is, it was someone that was on Reddit. I think someone said, like, why does this guy make the most depressing soundtracks you've ever heard and the happiest like 8-bit music you've ever heard? Like, how can this be the same person? So I was like, okay, that artist division was probably sensible. So those are the main ones.
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties when you are super prolific, and you because it's also rare, even among artists, for someone to have multiple different points of interests, and also even more rare to do them at the level at which you do that, because and obviously this is just one man's opinion, but it's of serious quality. So that's super rare. But yeah, I understand the difficulty, because, and also I listened to the Banished Vault soundtrack, which is again like ambient cinematic. I don't know how you would describe that, but that's even again like could be worthy of a different artist name altogether. But it's when you have so much stuff you want to put out there, and you're also trying to gravitate people towards it. It's like, am I going to have 5 different artist monikers, or is it just going to be that one? So that's.
But Banished Vault and also sort of I did some more music for the game Fights in Tight Spaces. So we did some music for the DLC for that. That was myself and my very, very good friend, Ollie Horton, who goes by the name Dream Track. So we've done, it's sort of Nervous Test Pilot and Dream Track is kind of those ones. And I need to talk to him about this, actually. I think it would be nice for us to maybe have a collab kind of project name or a different artist name for those, because I definitely see us doing more of that. But then again, then you end up with like another thing to try and get people, pointed towards. But yeah, Banished Vault was, it's good, that you mentioned that. That was another sort of departure because it's quite dark and quite sort of minimal in some ways, which is very different from other stuff I've done. But again, it was sort of, to try and get people to follow that line through on that one. We put it out kind of with our names together, but it's that stuff is hard. The branding and so on is hard.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting topic. I've talked about that with other guests on the podcast, because many of them have had different sort of endeavors in music. But there are perks to both sides. On one hand, we maybe put too much emphasis on the naming, because in reality, a person is going to hear something and they either love it or don't, and then they will follow or not. But on the other hand, it definitely is easier to, brand and market and share and distribute your music if it is under like a very specific umbrella, because it can be difficult for people to understand what is this about. But then again, another brand could be that you are a composer, let's say under the title of Nervous Test Pilot, and then you do a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, I mean, mainly if you are one single person who doesn't have a lot of time or money or resources to, market all the different, titles that you have, then it can be super tough to get any of them anywhere. So it's definitely a lot of trade-offs both ways. So, but yeah, I mean, people should definitely check out, Ensnare, Nervous Test Pilot, and also on top of that, you're part of the Mode 7, which is a company, like indie game publisher company, and also you originally, as I understand it, you're also developing games.
That's right. Yeah. So Mode 7 was started in 2005, and it was myself and a friend from school, actually. So we'd known each other for a long time, and we started off making indie games with a couple of other people. And then, so he left the company in 2019, and that sort of changed shape into, we're still in contact and we still work on sort of past projects together. And we're actually thinking about maybe we could do some new projects together, but the company kind of changed at that point. So Mode 7 sort of turned into a label that I subsequently have used to publish other games. So Fights in Tight Spaces was me kind of using that as a name. I mean, we're coming back to branding again. That was a situation where, we'd done some publishing together, and then we agreed that I could continue using that name to kind of keep continuity as I did more game publishing. Yeah, so my real sort of start in music, I would say professionally, was kind of via the route of being in an indie game studio, and contributing to design and marketing and all of that business development, writing, like all these different tasks on indie games. And the sort of prize for that was that I got to do the soundtracks and audio and kind of combine that work together. So that's really been my experience. And it's also, it can make it difficult sometimes to talk to people who are very, pure musicians who just write music. And I always sometimes feel like I've cheated because I kind of got in through this route of, my answer to how do I become a games composer is start a game development studio, which is not a helpful answer for people. So that's been my sort of routine.
It might be to some people. Yeah. But yeah, so basically, just for the listener, you have your hands in a lot of different things, and you do them at a very high level. So definitely want to loop back to the the indie game publishing stuff as well, because that's something I've been able to, have a peek behind the curtain for the past couple of years. So definitely interested in learning a bit more about that. But I thought we would just start from the very, very beginning, just to get like some idea of your personal background and upbringing. So I presume you were born in the UK?
Yeah, that's right. So I was born kind of fairly close to London, and then my family moved to Scotland when I was 3. So to the northeast of Scotland, to a village kind of near the coast. So all of my first memories are of Scotland. And that was, so my dad got a job there teaching in a boarding school, which is kind of this remote boarding school. And so his job was, he was an IT teacher. So he set up their computing department, and this was sort of mid 80s. So it was kind of, early DOS computers and that kind of stuff. So a lot of my first memories are being there. And my mum was a teacher as well. She was an English teacher, and she gave up work to have me. So a lot of my early memories are sort of spending time with my mum. My dad was working a lot, and then I would sometimes go into the school with my dad when he would go in to shut down the computer network at night, which was the thing that you had to do then. So I was around like that kind of stuff a lot in this kind of interesting place in Scotland. And then when I was 5, we moved down to Oxford, so moved back to England, and then I grew up around Oxford area until I was 18 and went to university. So those are the kind of we didn't move around a lot, but because it was such a formative time, I sort of remember being in this place and having all these memories, and then suddenly having to move, and kind of everything changed. We moved to quite a big town from a tiny village. So that's the sort of very beginning.
Do you have any siblings, or are you
just me?
Only child? And thinking about the technology side, because I was born in 89, and I have a lot of memories from my childhood of being, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but technology was always super interesting to me. Just to, like, I would love to, if we had like an old telephone or like an old computer or something, I would get permission to kind of break it open and look at all the stuff. I didn't understand anything about it, but I found it to be fascinating. So was technology, because of your dad's job especially, were you surrounded by technology a lot? And what was your sort of, how did you think about technology as it was surrounding you?
Yeah, it was very impactful for me, kind of going into that room of all these computers. So he had a network of they were 186 PCs. I don't know if you kind of know much about retro PCs, but they were sort of MS-DOS kind of PCs that had a text-based interface, like no Windows. There's a BBC Micro there as well, sort of very, very similar. And the kind of programs were very rudimentary. So lots of sort of bright colors, very blocky graphics. Things would take a long time to load. The machine would kind of make all these sounds and smells as well, sort of. So it's very sort of my response to it was kind of an aesthetic response. So I wasn't good at maths when I was a kid, and sort of various reasons for that. I kind of felt like my parents always said I didn't have good maths teaching when I was little. I don't know if that's true, but I didn't gravitate towards maths. I kind of gravitated towards it more as a sort of aesthetic thing. And yeah, I think kind of the sound of it and that atmosphere, this feeling of computers were like a different world. And that's not true anymore, because we're so used to phones and we're so used to it being integrated into our lives and kind of mapping onto the real world. But in that era, sort of mid 80s, the computer world was a sort of evocative idea, and you had movies like Tron and that kind of thing. Going into the computer was this exciting idea. So I was very, inspired by that, and I always found that very, very exciting. But I never wanted to do electronics or programming, or because I thought that was sort of sciencey math stuff that I was bad at. And that interest in me has grown more. I'm not a good programmer by any means. I'm not very technical on that side, but I definitely have a much greater understanding and affinity for that now as an adult, sort of middle-aged adult, than I did as a kid. So it's a little bit unusual. Like, I think a lot of people, certainly people I talk to in games, would kind of immediately want to be programming the computers and making them do things. And I didn't want to do that. I kind of just wanted to experience them, and games were a huge part of that as well. Just, the things the computer could do.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar in many ways to my kind of relationship to the tech. And I think that's a super interesting observation of, like, if you grow up today, you'll have, well, I haven't given my kid much technology to play with yet, but I would presume a lot of kids grow up having, iPads and phones, from the get-go, and technology is sort of, it's always a part of your life from the very beginning. But even, for me, it was a very, like you said, like quite a separate world, and there was like excitement and mystery about it. And I don't actually know why, but I've always, like, most of the developments that we've had in the internet technology front have always seemed super obvious to me. And I've been thinking, like, why is this taking so long? Like, this is the kind of stuff that I was already thinking about as a kid. Not to say that I'm any sort of a genius in that front, but it just felt like a natural continuation of what I saw there. And I always thought, like, well, internet is that's the place to be, like, and I always sort of wanted to do something, in that space. Do you have any? I'm trying to formulate how I want to kind of put this question, but yeah, I guess we probably should continue on from that, but I'll loop back to it if I catch the tail end of what I was thinking about. What were you like as a kid in sort of general temperamental terms? Like, were you sort of more introverted or extroverted, or
definitely more introverted. I was quite anxious, I think, as a very young kid. I remember a lot of different experiences, just being really worried about stuff. But I always had very close friends, which I think is something that is fairly common with introverted younger kids. So I wasn't on my own a lot. I had, a really good friend in the village that I lived in, and we would kind of go all over the village and explore and stuff. And I made friends quickly when I moved school, sort of when I was 5, 6. I remember making friends quickly, and I liked being around other kids. So it wasn't it was that. I think it was, a lot of it was being worried about doing the wrong thing was an experience that I had, internally a lot when I was very young, and anxiety about that. And I think, it was something I definitely kind of consciously worked on as I got older, and I'm one of the lucky people who I feel like I sort of processed that quite well, as an older kid and a teenager. Certainly I kind of got over that, but I remember feeling just overwhelmed a lot by kind of how big the world is, and I had some bullying experiences and stuff, which is kind of fairly common as well. So it was feeling like there are these threats out there, and that the world is kind of big and scary. I think was that, but combined with, I had a very loving home life, and I still have a really good relationship with my parents, which I just think is one of the luckiest things you can have in the drawer of life, is parents that genuinely really care about you, are present, always have your best interests at heart, and it's an incredibly lucky gift that I have. And obviously I have many friends for whom that's not the experience, and they have to deal with that growing up. So yeah, it was that combo of things, of sort of the world being a big scary place, but I've always felt safe at home, and I felt a lot of love in my family. So yeah.
Do you feel like that kind of ambient anxiety and maybe, I don't know, I get the impression that you maybe are pretty good at risk management because of that, like that maybe that anxiety
Yeah, that's
being there.
It's an interesting observation. I mean, risk is a very complicated thing because it is something that you can calculate in a lot of instances, but then it has this very powerful emotional component depending on how you perceive the risk and so on. And I would say I'm quite a risk averse person overall, but I also recognize, again, from sort of growing up and processing some of this stuff, just how much it can really hold you back if that's the prime thing you spend your life on, is managing risks all the time and never stepping outside. That's devastating, and that can cause huge losses for people. So it's something I think about a lot. Like you sort of pick that up, and I think that's natural. If your temperament is like that, you do think about it. But I do always want to kind of challenge myself, and part of that is being bored if you get stuck in the same thing, or you don't get to have those bigger wins, I think, if you're overly careful. And again, this is a lot of this is a big function of luck in my life, and sort of friends I've had and people who've encouraged me and pushed me outside my comfort zone to do different things. But yeah, no, you're right. Sort of the calculation and understanding of risk is something that's quite important to me.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to bring that up is I think there's a lot of people who experience anxiety, who may be temperamentally sort of more neurotic. Unfortunately, they don't discover the upside of it, like the superpower side of it, because everything has, everything is like a two-ended sword. No.
Sure. Yeah, that'll do. That's perfect.
Double-edged sword,
yeah.
I believe. Yeah. So it's like in the best case scenario, I think a person becomes capable of kind of flipping the negative of it into an upside, and maybe ideally in terms of, and when someone says risk management, it doesn't, at its best, it's simply about being as connected to the truth as possible, knowing as many variables as possible, and simply knowing as much of the true state of the world, and among that understanding, making decisions about upsides and downsides. So it doesn't have to be all about like a negative mental state in terms, like you said, because I was like that. I would look at the world in terms of like danger, 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 and that's not a good thing at all. No. So yeah, eventually you want to get to a point where you can use that to your advantage to understand some of the limitations in reality, and then starting to do things like you said. You can't live life like that. You can't live in a sheltered bubble.
I can't remember the exact source of this, unfortunately, but I did see something recently that was talking about decision quality, and the fact that decision quality can actually go down if you have more information. And I just think that's really fascinating. And that's something that more, as you say, kind of neurotic, more anxious people who are that way inclined, I think that's a message that could be really helpful. A sort of, if you have enough information to make a kind of clear decision, if you go beyond that, your decisions start to get worse, and you start to be slow, and you start to kind of do it wrong. So I'm quite a fan of the, take the time and do the planning and look around, but then make a decision and go and decide and live with the consequences of the decision. It's something I have to tell myself a lot, because left to my own devices, I would be getting more info and more info and more info. And it's not always a positive thing. So yeah, you're right. You can use these things, to propel you forward, but also you have to not rely on them as a crutch too much. And it's the same for people who don't really perceive risk that much. Very confident people, people who are more impulsive, if they lean into that too far, then that can obviously go wrong for them. So I think it's about trying to understand that opposite perspective. I love working with people who are very gung-ho and excitable and find the next thing and run after it, because that sort of pulls me along, and I go, oh, okay, I won't worry about these issues. I'll sort of follow that. So it's that combination, particularly in different people, I think, that can be very, very powerful. You can modulate each other. And if you have a relationship where there's a lot of communication, that can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I'd also say that a lot of people use information gathering as an excuse or like a barrier against fear, because they think, oh, the more information I have, the the more I can control the situation, and then I can tackle every single, negative turn. But there's always
I
going to be.
definitely do that. I definitely still.
Yeah, no, and I speak from experience as well. But it's like the information, too much information isn't really. It's only too much information in relation to your ability to prioritize and execute.
Yeah,
like it doesn't matter if you have like 5 pieces of information or 5,000. Regardless what that is, you need to have the skill and the ability to, again, prioritize and execute. Like, what matters now, and let's do that. So that's definitely something worth thinking about. In terms of music, were your parents musical, or when did music sort of come into the picture?
So my dad always played the guitar sort of from when he was very, very young. And he was playing the guitar a lot at home when I grew up. And I had a little toy keyboard, and I used to try and play along with him, and he'd try and sort of harmonize whatever nonsense I was playing on the keyboard. So that was my first experience of it. And then, played music a lot at home. Like, remember my dad playing sort of early rock and roll stuff like the Shadows a lot. This kind of instrumental guitar music was very popular, and I remember kind of hearing some 80s pop music and stuff, like nothing very well defined because I was very small, but sort of hearing some electronic sounds kind of coming in. And certainly early 90s when I was a bit older, I used to hear the kind of Eurodance stuff like Too Unlimited and like that kind of thing. When you've never really heard that music, like that's your first exposure to it often is that pop version of it. So I remember I really loved Too Unlimited when I was sort of 6 and that kind of thing. And I did have piano lessons and things like that. I wasn't a very good student, so I didn't practice very hard. I hated practice. I hated scales. I didn't like going to the lessons. I kind of found the teacher like a bit scary. Like I just didn't. It wasn't for me. But I loved just sitting at the keyboard. My parents got me a keyboard, and I'd sit there and just play the keyboard for hours and hours and hours. Just not really with any structure in mind. Just like figuring out chord sequences and learning to improvise. So I was always very, very motivated to create things, but very unmotivated to do hard work and learn the structure.
This sounds oddly familiar. So did you was there a point where you started contemplating on whether music would be like a viable, not necessarily yet as a career option, but was music something you did on the side casually that you had a curiosity in, or was it very early on like, oh, I need to do more of this?
I was having an interesting conversation about this at the weekend, because one of my nieces she made a short film, and it was in a film competition, and there were some kids in that competition who were they were studying film as a subject at secondary school, and they were kind of submitting stuff, and we were sort of talking about it, and there was definitely at that time a sort of perception that things that weren't core academic subjects, so we're kind of jumping forward now to sort of secondary school age, things that weren't core academic subjects, maths, English, science, were sort of lesser. So you could study music, but it wasn't seen as like a proper subject that would get you, into a good university necessarily. So, and my secondary school's music teaching was very geared around like the classical music grades, and also studying for, GCSE and A levels we have in the UK, exams for music. So there wasn't much culture of sort of making music in a formal setting. So it was always something I did outside. And I was, good at English, my mum being an English teacher, so I kind of had that influence. So English was sort of my academic subject that I was, I loved doing it. It was sort of very easy for me to do. So I sort of focused on that academically, English and art subjects, so languages and history and that kind of thing. I was always happy doing that. But music was not a career, it was not sort of seen as the way that you made money. And it was just one of those things but it was just happening a lot around me. So when I was, when we'd moved to Oxford had one of, at the time, I think the biggest the largest number of bands per capita of any city in the UK. So Oxford music scene is very, thriving. The school I went to was the same school that Radiohead went to. So I wasn't there at the same time as them, but they had just left. So there was a lot of that feeling in the school of kind of, oh, there's these creative people around and so on. So it was in the culture where I was hugely, and sort of something that you could do, but it was not like I didn't know anyone who made money from music, or you weren't encouraged to. There wasn't like a person you went to on careers day to be like, I'm going to be a musician. Yeah.
So what was your intro into the world of either like starting to play or record music? You mentioned you took some piano lessons, but that wasn't really doing much for you. Did you at some point, like, did you buy a synthesizer or a computer, or what was the entry point into music for you?
So there were sort of two things. My dad sort of continued his interest in music, so he bought like a Yamaha PSR keyboard, the general MIDI keyboard that has like the trumpet sound and the gunshot sound, like that kind of thing. And we had a computer at home that had like the first version of Cubase, which didn't have audio capacity, so it was just MIDI. So you could record MIDI sequences and play them back on this general MIDI keyboard, and then I could take that output of the keyboard and record it into like a tape deck. So I could record music. So my first music was just stupid stuff that I made to make my friends laugh at school. So it would be like me badly playing Wonderwall on like the guitar sound, and just like going like, oh hey, have you heard this song, and just putting it on at school, and just stupid stuff like that. So that was it. That was my first kind of recording. And then when I was a little bit older, I made friends with Ollie, who is Dream Track at school, and he had more stuff. So his dad was super into music. He had some more recording things in his house. Had a sampler. I'd never seen a sampler before, and a couple of synths, and he had a CD burner as well, which I didn't have. So I used to go to his house, and again, a lot of this stuff was. It was to make people laugh at school was kind of the highest achievement you could make. So we weren't really making serious music at all. It was more kind of just like stuff you could play to your friends and sort of just be part of that kind of thing. But it was
what age was this?
So that was the first stuff I did was like age 12. And then I would have been 14 sort of when I met Ollie, and I was, that was the evolution into trying to make sort of actual music. I think it's difficult to sort of explain this to younger people now, because the tools are so different. You have professional tools just in your computer. We didn't have professional tools. We had like bits of things of sometimes secondhand kit, or like whatever your parents had, or whatever your friend's dad had, or like that stuff. So it was trying to make like a serious piece of well-produced music was literally impossible. So you had to work with this kind of weird stuff, and that kind of fueled that. But yeah, I would say I really it sort of crossed over from being like something I did, like one of my hobbies. So I played video games and like do other stuff. I played sport a bit when I was younger, and that kind of like disappeared. And then
what was that?
I played rugby when at end of primary school, start of secondary school. And there were a few things like I hated the practice. They made me play a position which was kind of completely crazy for me. They made me a flanker, so I was in the scrum, and like being a small guy, like I wanted to be a back and like pass the ball and run around. And because I was short, they're like, no, you're going in the scrum. All you do is like smack into people and tackle them. And I'm like, and when kids started getting bigger, and I didn't, like, that wasn't a good option for me either. So that fell by the wayside. But then music, 14, 15, like music completely took over. I was just spending all my spare time on music. And the reason for that was it was that making something, then it started to be like people thought you were cool if you made, proper music. So then I'd try and make albums and like dance music and stuff, and I'd play music at friends' birthday parties and like kind of DJ with rubbish equipment, and then try and like put some of your own music in there and sort of see if people respond to it. So it transitioned to that at that age.
Yeah. Before we move past that, you mentioned wanting to make people laugh. Is that something that has humor always been at the center of your temperament somehow? Or
yeah, it has. So I know I have several good friends who are professional comedians, so I kind of gravitated towards those people, and I did a little tiny bit at school, but I was never sort of into that side of things at school as much, and it's not something that I've ever pursued seriously, mostly because of how hard it is. It's incredibly hard to do that. I would say harder than music. I don't know if musicians are going to get up in arms now, but like to be a professional comedian now is unbelievably hard. It's such a small number of people who make it. So yeah, it's been part of it. And I would say a little bit later on when I was doing live performances and stuff, I would do, again, stupid music to kind of get a reaction. Like I would do kind of breakcore versions of folk songs, or like just, that crazy era of very aggressive production on something kind of twee or sweet, or like just that kind of thing, was something I did when I was playing live. So that came back again later of just like, I want a crowd reaction. I'm gonna play like Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now by the Smiths over an Amen break, and like see how many kind of diehard Smiths fans I can upset in the audience, that kind of thing. So yeah, it came back, lesser so now, but sort of at that time.
Yeah, I can definitely hear like especially maybe in on the snare front, right. There's a lot of, you can definitely hear that, like you're having fun with it, you're having a laugh, and not that it's not serious music, it very much is, but you can you can hear the lightness, and that someone's having fun with it when they're making it. Do you find that humor is like an important part of how you go through life? Like, because for me it's definitely, it's a really important tool in terms of kind of trivializing some of the difficulties in life. Like you can go through a lot of tough or mundane or tedious stuff, but if you can laugh about it somehow, that it makes it like 1,000 times easier. Do you find that that's valid?
I think it's essential, especially so I'm 40 now, and kind of this age, like a lot of people get very serious, and they get, they've got their family and their career, and they're worried about their mortgage and all of these things. Like it's very stressful time. And I just think you have to have something to take you out of that stuff, because otherwise it's like, what are you going to do? You're going to fulfill this purpose and role and like be super serious about it and not really enjoy yourself. And then that's, your life is done. So it's kind of, trying to keep some lightness in your life, and like some, like you say, some ability to cast a serious thing in a stupid light. Like I always have friends who are able to do that. And it is important to me. I mean, it's sort of, it's just part of living life and processing things and enjoying your time here is being able to not take yourself too seriously as well. I think that's hugely important, and it's very easy to get caught up with that. Again, I think that can be something of an age thing. I think it's easy to go like, oh, I should have done all these things like by this age, or I should be this person, right? And that's innately funny to me. It's the idea that you can construct your life in such a way that you have some moral obligation to be a certain person is sort of, I think hubris is sort of one of the funniest things, and the ability, if you catch yourself doing that and going like, this is ridiculous, what am I doing? That's helpful, I think.
Yeah. I usually, because I took myself so seriously when I was younger, and I really now like try not to take myself very seriously at all. But I on the kind of the balance of it is that I like to take life seriously in terms of like, we're all going to die. So not in terms of like becoming this rigid, serious panicky person, but like, I want to do stuff with this, and it's get serious about it, because a lot of people don't get serious about life, and then they just don't do the things they want to do in life. So that's
it's a balance again, isn't it? Like I think, you can think, oh, my life's worthless and there's no point doing anything, or you can think, I am the single most important person in the world, and my every thought is critical, and everyone must hear it immediately. And I think there's probably like some middle ground, right? Of kind of, you're not the Messiah, but you're also, not a waste of matter, a waste of space. It's sort of you gotta get the position right. And again, this is stuff like, I don't pretend to be good at any of this. I just want to make that abundantly clear to anyone watching or listening to this. Like I don't think I have nailed any of these things. This is all stuff that I think it has to be a work in progress, right, for everyone. But I definitely, the taking seriously, for me, it's about making sure that I'm making things has always been very important to me, or contributing to things being made is important. I think things going out into the world that you can say, oh, I made that, or I helped with that, or I caused that thing to happen. I think without that, I would find it very difficult. I have done more kind of cog in the machine things at different times, and that can be valuable. And it's not to say that everyone needs to judge themselves on their output at all. Like, people have different ways and they create value in different ways. But for me, I'm not happy unless a thing is happening and being produced. And that's something that I take seriously, because I know, that I will get unhappy if that's not happening for a long period of time. So I know I have to keep up, some kind of productive something.
Yeah, that's definitely something I do want to come back to. Lastly, touching on the humor, what was that like, not taking yourself too seriously or utilizing humor? Was that something you learned at a young age already, or was it something you sort of had to figure out later on?
Yeah, I think so. I think, it kind of helped me create those friendships. I've always had friends who were very different, and I've always had friends who didn't get on with each other. That's been a really common theme in my life. And I think humor is part of that. And I think it's being able to see a different perspective, and appreciate, and another thing that I really like, which I've learned is unusual, is if I can get someone talking about the thing they like, even if I know nothing about it, I find it completely fascinating. Even if that, like, I've had a very involved conversation with someone about waste management and about how you dig boreholes to put refuse in. And I've had a really long conversation with someone about different types of brick and like where they come from. And I have no interest in, engineering or waste management, but it's, if someone cares about that thing, and again, like, part of me does find that funny, like, to be in a conversation about holes for an hour. It's like, you're just like, how did I get here? And then you're just finding that gently funny in the background. But I think that really helps in terms of getting to know other people, because everyone sort of likes talking about the things they're interested in. And if my response to that is to like be interested in you, but still find that sort of slightly amusing, I think that's okay. Like, I think that's a good bridge. Yeah.
And in the end, everything is about holes. If you talking about bad humor, Yeah. Trying to bridge the gap. I mean, you talked a bit about the game development side, the Mode 7 stuff. That was sort of, I don't know if you use this word, but like entry into making music. So sort of bridging the gap between, okay, now you're doing sort of more serious music stuff, presumably as a hobby at that point, and then you have Mode 7 where you start to develop games. What was the transition like in terms of starting to make and release music seriously? Like, how did that happen?
So probably the best way to deal with that is sort of talk about Mode 7 kind of and how that came about. So that was my friend Ian, and he sort of started working on games in 2002. So he was at university and he was using a game engine for some of his university work. And then it was an engine called the Talk engine, which no one knows about now. This was pre-Unity, pre sort of modern Unreal. Like, there were no commercial games engines that you could just license as a normal human. So he was doing that. He started making a game, and he said, "Oh, you do music," because he knew that I did music from school, and we talked about music. Can you make some music? So from 2002 to sort of when I graduated 2005, I was making music for this game, and then gradually it was sort of, we had other friends working on it, and they all just dropped away and gave up, until it was sort of just me and Ian and our friend Robin at one point, who was our level designer and tester. And then that caused me to, I just wanted to get this thing done. I was interested in the process. I needed, to do some work when I graduated. So I kind of focused on that. So all of the music energy kind of went into the games, because it was just sort of, I'm contributing to this project. I need this project to get done. So I wasn't really releasing stuff separately, apart from there was a sort of, one of the ways I supported myself when we were doing that, because we weren't making any money, was I wrote for a magazine called Computer Music Magazine. And I did all sorts of things, interviews, reviews, news stuff. I did a games audio news column in there for years. And then through that and some other things, I ended up working with a dance music producer, a guy called Pete Richardson, who was doing a lot of, like, it was called kind of UK hardcore music. So like 175 BPM, like very fast kind of kick drum music and hard dance and that kind of thing. And he taught me a lot of my real production abilities came from working with him. So I did an interview with him for the magazine. And then I was like, do you want to work together and make a track? So I kind of paid him to engineer a track together. And then we did some other projects together. And some of that came out on, there's like I don't know if you can see, there's like a white label vinyl behind me somewhere. It may be obscured by things, but that was the first sort of release I did. So this was happening in parallel to the early game stuff. I was doing that. I was trying to learn real production skills, because again, sort of, as I mentioned, growing up with like no equipment, and then 2005 kind of time, like everything was more, in the box at that point, and you had to learn kind of how to do that. So that was sort of my first releases. And then that was combined with performing live a lot, which I did in Oxford. There was a local festival there called the Truck Festival, which just was the back part of a truck that bands would play on in a field. And then that grew from that to having more tents and stages around, and it became like a big local thing. So I would play there every year. I was doing this dance music stuff, and I was doing the game soundtracks. So those were kind of my early releases, really.
And what age were you sort of in this time period?
Yeah, so started probably playing live when I was like 17, 18. And then the early game stuff was kind of through university. So from that age to 21. So I was sort of 21, 22 when I was doing the dance music stuff and the early game soundtrack stuff. So it's that spread of like end of childhood, sort of early adulthood.
Yeah. And when was the time when your music sort of, when did you have, and in terms of when I say like your sort of breakthrough, I don't mean like selling millions of records, but actually like seeing the needle move, like seeing something actually happen and take place. When was that, and how did it happen?
I mean, I guess I had a couple of, there was one truck festival year, which was, I don't know the size of audience, but it was quite a big tent, and it was full of people, just for my set. And I'd kind of become like a sort of, it's a tiny festival, so I'm not trying to big it up as like a must-see thing at that festival, where everyone kind of like makes sure they caught my set, and this thing, like people like outside the tent. And that was a moment when I kind of realized like, there's actually something happening here that's bigger than just me kind of playing around and doing these little gigs and stuff. So that was one experience. But the real life-changing thing was Frozen Synapse, the game Frozen Synapse that we did, that came out in 2011. So that game kind of took off. It was in the early era of Steam, where Valve had to contact you to put your game on Steam. So you had to like put something out, and they liked it. Someone from Valve would reach out. I know this is the amount of stuff that's changed is unbelievable. But we got that email from Valve after years of trying to talk to them and like not being able to get anyone there. That then propelled the game. The game was critically really well received and won some awards and things. But the reaction to the soundtrack was just, beyond my imagining of, everything we ever posted would have people talking about the soundtrack. It would come up in reviews a lot, like in these magazines that I'd grown up reading. There would be, journalists would be talking about the soundtrack. And yeah, and it was selling well. We sold it through our own website as a sort of bundle with the game. It was making real money. So that was the point where I kind of went, oh, I've created something that's sort of made an impact. So it was very much in combination with the game. Yeah, and it was a very, very surreal thing, because it wasn't something that was particularly visible. It wasn't sort of getting signed to a big label, or like a big DJ plays your track, or like one of those experiences. It was just like, just kind of came out of all this work we were doing together. Yeah, it was a cool time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of moment in time, because I've also, some of the other composers that I've talked with, they mentioned that they did the soundtrack and they thought it was okay. It wasn't like they thought this was going to be huge, or they didn't work on it or prepare the music, thinking it was going to be anything big. And then, the game releases and they have this huge like flood of people and praise coming their way. What were your expectations music-wise going into it, or were you sort of, even thinking about it, were you sort of more concerned about having a successful game? And
yeah, I was more concerned about having a successful game, but also it was very much that feeling of, it was sort of the first time I'd ever put everything into a body of work, of music. It was the first time I'd gone like, okay, I have these resources, like I have this software and I have these monitors and I have this amount of time. What if I just try to create something that has the right feeling and is really deeply personal to me at the same time? And I just poured everything into it. And I remember the game took a long time to develop. So I had this massive luxury of a huge amount of time. Some of the tracks on that took, 2 months, which is something I can't afford to do that now. I would love to be able to spend 2 months on a piece of music for a project, and I can't. So back then I just put all my time in, all my effort in. I spent all the money I had on plugins and trying to create that. So for me, it was sort of, but the idea behind that was just to make the game as good as possible, because we had a failed game. So the first thing we were working on, the thing I was working on at university, we didn't manage to get that on Steam. It was like, it didn't sell very much. It had a retail release which went horribly wrong, and the publisher kind of collapsed, and it was awful. So, but we didn't really care at that point, because we were just we're going to try and do more stuff. But this was the whole premise of Frozen Synapse, was, can we make something good? That was the question. Having made something mediocre, it wasn't really about finances. The company was doing contract work. We were kind of I was doing this writing, we were supporting ourselves just about from that. But it was, yeah. So that was kind of where it started, and then to see it connect with people in sort of the way I kind of envisaged, just in emotional terms, not in commercial terms, was massive. Yeah.
When you finished that soundtrack, did you feel good about it, or were you sort of, I wish I could have done this or differently, or?
Because it had taken place over such a long period of time, I definitely wanted to redo the early tracks and kind of go back to them, and I didn't do that. So I definitely had that feeling of I did some stuff wrong there. I don't remember much about it. It sort of dragged on so long, and it kind of ended up finishing around the same time of the game. I think I was so caught up in, finishing a video game, as is brutally hard. It doesn't matter what scale of game it is. It's a horrific process that's deeply painful. And I was just kind of caught up in that. So I didn't have a moment of here's the master of the soundtrack is done now. I mean, until sort of very, very late in the process. But I remember liking it. I listen to my own music a lot. Which I think is a little bit unusual. I know a lot of people who can't do it, or they get bored of it. But if I make something that I can listen to, then I'm happy, and I could listen to it and be I wasn't sort of picking it apart all the time technically, and I know that's a good sign. So yeah.
And what can you when the game launched and then you started getting this influx of positive comments about the music. Well, like, could you describe what you were thinking at that time? What were you feeling?
I mean, it was the response to the game as a whole was the thing that made the most impact on us. And I remember we had the launch day. So we did a paid beta of the game. This was before early access. The term early access did not exist. So there was one other developer I knew, this guy called Cliff Harris, who made a game called Gratuitous Space Battles, and he did a pay pre-order and get the beta was what he called it. And we're like, oh, that's cool. So we did that. We put the beta out, and a journalist called Kieran Gillen, who wrote for PC Gamer for many years, was kind of a very well-known, one of the founders of Rock Paper Shotgun. He wrote a preview of the beta that went up on that site, and he was someone that we looked up to a lot. He was the first journalist that we ever met. When we were starting out, we were like trying to contact journalists, and when we had dinner with him, and this, when we were nobody, we were just early indie devs. He took the time to do that. So for him to write a really glowing preview, I think he said like, go and get it right now or something in the preview. We were just like, what's happening? Then the actual, and that was going well. We were making really good money from that, and we were able to finish the game from the pre-order money. So that was great. But then when it came out, there were things like the Eurogamer gave it, I think it was like a 9 out of 10 review when they had scoring. We had some other reviews come in early that were these dream scores, and for us it was. Again, it was the games magazine thing of we would read games magazines together a lot. And the idea that we'd made a 9 out of 10 game is, I still don't believe it. We got 9 out of 10 in Edge, which no one gets. So it was those reviews that really, made the impact. And then you see the Steam stats and you see the green line kind of go up at a certain point, and you just think, okay, well, things are different now. So that was the reaction. But beyond that, it was sort of, the music stuff specifically, I knew I'd put a lot of effort into it, and it just felt validating to see that effort align with a response, I think. But the emotions really around that time were just sort of, oh, hey, we're a real games company now, and we can make games and people like them. We figured out how to do something well. That was the main feeling.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's like a question in here, but what I'm sort of trying to trace there is that, well, first of all, unfortunately, a lot of musicians never actually release anything. So they don't really get on the train of, proper creation, because you do need to be in some sort of a dialogue with other people so you can reflect what your art, what your music actually does, and there's a big disconnect if you don't put stuff out there, because then you actually have to live with it, and that creates a truthful, honest feedback loop instead of it being on your hard drive. And then it can always be whatever your imagination kind of imagines it to be. But it's a super interesting topic in terms of working hard on something and putting it out there and seeing it see success. Did that process, what did that teach you about your music overall, or that soundtrack specifically? Because obviously it was successful, it got validated by your listeners and fans, but what were the sort of key takeaways you took from that?
I think it was a couple of things. It was, one is that the atmosphere, the kind of vibe of the thing you're producing is overwhelmingly the most important thing. And there are technical aspects that contribute to that. But as I said, like I wasn't as good. Like I'd worked with Pete, that professional engineer, and his engineering ability is way above mine. It's incredibly precise. He had a very specific way of doing things. And I was just like, I'm just going to do stuff and try and make it sound okay. And I learned that is all you need to do. And it's very difficult especially if you're around dance music, which can be hyper technical, particularly stuff like drum and bass. It's even in those genres, it's not about that ability, that the technical ability unlocks possibilities for you, but you don't need every possibility in the universe to make something cool that people like. You need to focus on the emotion of it. The sound choice is so much more important than mixing. It's finding sounds that work. I didn't really know what compression was when I made that music. Like, I didn't really know how to deal with kind of bass kick drum phasing issues, and I did stereo spread in this sort of, everything is just a big Haas effect. Like, there's no subtle panning. There's it's just, I was using waves doubler. I used to just go, and kind of, that was how I did stereo, and listening to some of that. And I even do it on bass sounds and stuff. So it sounds terrible. But so the main takeaway for me was, I think, just, make stuff that resonates with people, that conveys a feeling very strongly, and then you're fine. And also, it was sort of, I was trying to do this thing of kind of hybridizing some of the dance music stuff with some of the more soundtrack elements, and I really like making what I call, probably slightly derisively, real music. So music that has structure, particularly percussion, it has recognizable melodies. It has all of these things that you might associate with pop or dance music more than soundtracks. And I've subsequently worked on stuff which is more soundtracky, and that's been more kind of project specific. So I'm not trying to be dogmatic about this, but when I'm given the option of what I want to do, I will make tracks that have a shape and a structure to them that you can listen to outside the soundtrack. And that was a thing that was a sort of thesis I had going into that, because a lot of game music at that time was not good. That sort of early 2000s, it was a lot of stock drum loops and sort of very repetitive kind of stuff that just didn't sound like music to me. I'm being very derogatory, but I'm just trying to express kind of how I felt at that time. And so it was sort of validation of those choices of making things that I think stand as standalone pieces of music. We also didn't do dynamic music in the game. We just had a jukebox style of thing that would play the individual tracks, and I love that, and I still push for that. Wherever a lot of people in games are very worried about dissonance and tracks being too obtrusive, and I always say to them, what do you do when you're working? And they're like, oh, I just put Spotify on. And you're like, okay, so what do you do when someone's playing the game? They can listen to full pieces of music. It doesn't have to just be soundscapes. It can be music. So that's sort of were the opinions I kind of formulated around that time doing that work.
Yeah, the dynamic music question is fascinating to me, because to me it seems like, as a composer, obviously when you're making video music for video games, your primary job is to make something good for the video game. Yeah. Obviously, we also want to make good music, but it sort of has to fit into that framework. But from that perspective, if I'm thinking dynamic music, I wouldn't do it, because usually that framework tends to, what's the word? It tends to somehow affect the compositional process for a lot of composers, and then the music kind of ends up, well, the format tends to suck out the music itself, and then you're just simply left with maybe a bass stem that comes in when you have a fight, or a percussion stem that comes in when you have a fight. And then it becomes this, it's not like a cohesive piece of music. It's more like a layering combination of just sounds that are tonally somehow related. So to me, it seems like if I was to do a dynamic thing, it would, in the context of having that somehow be a relevant element in relation to the composition itself, it seems like it would be just like a super difficult task. And I've actually I don't think I've ever heard anything that kind of ticks the boxes in that way for me. So it seems like if I want to have a good piece of music for this video game, in most cases I would go with, what's the term you used? Like actually just having the track.
Yeah, jukebox kind of style. Is the way
that like a official term for that?
That's the way I think of it. I mean, my sort of that kind of style of music, I always think about Command and Conquer and Red Alert and those early games, because they had really quite crazy soundtracks that had all this like kind of industrial, like weird sample. They had vocal samples in there, speech samples, and everyone, certainly my age who grew up with those games loved that stuff. Like, you'd quote the vocal samples to each other, like that kind of thing. So that's the sort of the style of non-dynamic music. In terms of dynamic music, I used to say I hate dynamic music and I'll never do it. And that's crazy, because I think there are, like you say, if it's something that can be part of the creative process and it works with the material, and it's not just the stealth cue and the action cue fighting against each other as you walk in and out of an area, like that's always going to be bad. There are more subtle ways you can do it. I think horror can do it really well. Someone I really admire in horror scoring is Jason Graves and his kind of Dead Space work and that stuff, and which is very textural, and that works super well in those contexts. So especially if something is more abstract, if it doesn't follow kind of musical form as much, then I think it can work really well. Another one is Eamon Tobin's Splinter Cell stuff. I think that's one of the best modern game soundtracks, is Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, and that, again, dynamic music didn't necessarily work that well in game, but when it does work, it's good. And his style of layering and that kind of collage style works super well in that. So I think it's about is it adding to the gameplay, is it adding to the project, and then is it being considered sort of from day one? I think we might see some more interesting uses of it, especially as you can do a lot more real-time kind of computationally now than you used to be able to do. So there might be some better decision making of going, like, maybe you can modulate into this key and this number of bars, but you're not breaking the structure of the music. Maybe real-time synthesis and stuff is very interesting, potentially. So there's definitely scope for it, but I my heart is in the older style, I think.
Yeah. No, it definitely, at the very least, raises a lot of interesting questions about music composition itself, because like you just described, I'd be more keen on an approach that somehow incorporates that technology into the composition itself and makes it somehow more interesting, because I think this is one of those cases where just because there's a technological opportunity for something doesn't mean it's the thing you should be doing. But again, on a case by cases. Going back to what you said about ensuring that the vibe stays in the music, have you found that there are some key elements, talking from a more technical perspective in terms of like the mixing side of things, some of the things that ensure that the vibe and the emotion stays in there? Like, what are some of the things that if you do this, it usually sucks it out somehow?
So I'm a really big fan of the drum and bass act called Noisier, and the sort of one of the people in that act is a guy called Nick Roos, and he is a fantastic producer. He's one of the most technically advanced electronic music producers I think ever. His technical ability is so incredible, and he said something that I think is really relevant to this, which is you can engineer everything very precisely, but you have to put that against a very rough sounding element as well. Otherwise, you don't get that movement and contrast. So if you have super perfect, super tuned drum sounds that the fundamental hits at precisely the right frequency and the transient does this and it's perfectly clear, you might want to have a bass sound that just kind of goes everywhere and is messy, that comes in and hits for a single beat, because it will change the shape of the track, and it will push your awareness in a specific direction. So although I'm nowhere near that level technically, I like that idea because it means that you can include these elements that might feel a bit dissonant. I don't necessarily like mixes that are super glued together, and that's quite common in a lot of different styles. I don't mind something where an instrument is poking out and might be a bit louder, or it might be the dynamics might be a little bit less controlled. It might be EQ'd in a slightly weird way. I like that stuff. I think it's a big back and forth for me, this is particularly as I've learned more technical stuff kind of going through. It's so much about designing for that end effect. If you want something to be, super overwhelming, and there's another drum and bass producer I really like, called a guy called Current Value, and his work is it's the most abrasive. It's so hard to listen to. It's just screeching sounds and then irregularly kind of gated bass sounds and little tiny spiky drums. It doesn't sound like anyone else. If you're trying to create that effect, you need to go away and study, like, how do I set my clippers at this level? And a lot of his mixes are like minus 1.5 LUFS and like that kind of thing, where and it needs to sound like that for that style. It needs to hit you in the face as soon as you put it on. So that means you have to study all that stuff and work on it. But people take that as like, they put that technical thing on a pedestal of like, if my mixes aren't this clean and this loud and the phase is perfect and this thing, like, I can't compete with this. And it's just, you need to be really specific about that, because you're actually losing, particularly with dynamics, like you can be losing atmosphere, you can be trampling all over that. And it's funny, a producer that everyone talks about all the time is Burial. And Burial famously is kind of very untechnical and was making music with sort of ridiculous software, and it's mixed very quietly and it's all over the place. And it's you're trying to serve the vibe of the track with the technical. As soon as that clicks for you, it really unlocks so many things, because it motivates you to learn the important technical things and improve, but it also means you're not just focusing on that and you lose it. So that's a kind of rambling answer, but that's because it's a very like an amorphous and complicated idea, I think. It's very genre specific as well.
Yeah, and that's because music is so intertwined. You can't tweak something without having the perception of something else change. So it's you can't think about it in terms of, I'm absolutely going to tweak this here and this here and this here, because you tweak one thing and then another thing turns. So it's like an ever evolving puzzle that you're trying to move into this one shape. And this is definitely something I struggle with, because I can, first of all, I can get very obsessive and perfectionistic about these things. So, and I know I can go into any sound and tweak it to sound really great on its own, which obviously doesn't really matter in terms of a full mix, but I know I can do that, and I'm inclined to do that. But what I have noticed is that the vibe and somehow the sonic fullness of it, for the lack of a better word. What I mean by that is the vibe. It's like the feeling energy of it tends to dissipate, and that's what I'm trying to balance. I think what you said about the contrast of having something maybe a bit smudgier and blurry compared to something else, that contrast is what you pick up and you respond to. So I think I'll try and incorporate that a lot more consciously.
There's another thing I saw which is really interesting, which is it's a video by a producer called Matt Zoe, who is someone I really admire. So you were talking about multi-genre people. So he was a trance producer signed to Anjuna Beats, this massive trance label, and then he also does drum and bass to an unbelievably high level. And he also does like French filter house, like disco house, and he has a label for that. He's a genius, and his production ability is incredible. And he had a video where he talked about kind of music as visuals and mixing as visuals, and how if you compress something more, it sounds like it's further away, because the transients don't kind of come and hit your eardrum in the same way as something that's closer. So it's kind of counterintuitive, because a lot of people think, oh, compress it and make it loud and put it in the front of the mix. And he was saying, instead of lowering levels of stuff you want in the background, just compress it. And that creates a depth in the dynamics, and then leave the lead sounds more spiky and transienty and dynamic, and they kind of will activate your brain more. And you need to get the overall kind of loudness of the track, and that loudness space correct to do this. But it was such an interesting way of thinking about it, because it's being intentional about how you're using the tools. Like a lot of people will say, oh, you need to compress things to kind of make them sit in the mix and sound loud. But this idea of that you're shaping it in terms of distance, and then you can work on that with EQ as well, and sort of higher, brighter top end is going to stick out, and kind of if you pan that out wider, you get that presence feeling in the top end, and the bass being kind of mono and more compressed makes it feel kind of like a 3D image going down to a point mono at the bass. I think some theoretical stuff like that can be very interesting in terms of how you treat mixing, because I think a lot of times when we mix, we do it on autopilot of like, it's good to boost this frequency of this sound. It's a piano, so I need to take the boominess out, and I need to, and that's like, okay, and some of those tricks are good, but you need to think about why you're doing it. What is that doing to the sound, and what effect is the sound having? And it's so easy to lose that, especially when you're working quickly and you're just like, I'm going to cut the low end out of all these sounds to make space for the bass. You kind of need to just go, do I need to do that? Like, what happens if I don't do that? It's just retaining that curiosity and having time to do it as well, building in time to the process to go, no, I'm not just going to do the thing I always do here. I'm going to try something else.
Yeah. Going into relating to this, maybe some of the observations you've had when writing the end snare stuff, because right now, and I'm asking this very selfishly, but hopefully, I mean, I'm sure, well, I hope it helps someone else as well. I'm trying to get this soundtrack, well, not deal, but I'm trying to write this soundtrack for this game that is, they want to, it's pixel based game, but the soundtrack is sort of intended to be more like SNES style. So I've been writing in that style for a while now to try and get myself onto that project, and I've been thinking about mixing for that genre and style a lot, because a part of me understands that, hey, originally on these devices there was no such thing as mixing. It's a balance and whatever tweaking they had on board the device. But now when I'm putting these tracks together, and I try and keep that mentality in my mind, but I'm also hearing qualities and elements that I don't enjoy about the natural sound of it. And also I should say that when I listen to a lot of those old soundtracks, as much as I might love the compositions themselves, sonically they can be pretty demanding to listen to. And also I do want to make this soundtrack sound a bit also modern, make it like a modern version of that. So, but also I'm of course concerned about, again, cutting out the good juice, the good vibes of those sounds, because they are very vibey. They take you back, hopefully, into that nostalgic era. So again, what are some of the observations you may have done in the area of chiptune, or maybe SNES stuff if you've played with that?
So that it's interesting. I'm actually working on a project that is using some SNES stuff at the moment. So it is something that I'm kind of dealing with too. Look, I think this whole area is the chiptune thing generally is so much rooted in people using the hardware and kind of coming from that perspective. So I think it's important to recognize that there is an artistic element to chiptune music that goes beyond just the sonic output. There is this idea of tools and so on. So giving that full, acknowledgement and respect, like ignoring all that, because for the purposes of soundtracks, it doesn't matter. So as long as you're not saying like, oh, I'm an amazing chiptune composer and here's my hardware and you're faking it, I think that's wrong. But sort of as soon as you get away from that you're not participating in that creative space, you're participating in something else, which is using sounds to sometimes evoke nostalgia or sometimes for the specific quality that they have. So the way I kind of approached in snare stuff, and if you listen to kind of I tried different configurations of it all the way through. So the first one I did was very basic. I did it on a laptop, kind of mostly while I was watching TV, just like did it really, really quickly, and then kind of sort of mixed it, and then just was like, oh, this is fun, and it had that raw quality to it. Then later on, I tried to shape it into like more of a hybrid dance music thing, where the drums would be produced as if they were dance music, and then the rest would be chip sounds. I think the way to do it is, it's to focus on the effect that you want in the specific moment. And I think for soundtrack work, just not to be prescriptive about is it authentic or not, because it sort of innately isn't. So I think letting go of that worry about, is this like would a real SNES sound exactly like this? I think that's helpful. And then I think it's just, so much of it is just down to taste. And one thing I found is that it's very subjective what people feel goes together and doesn't go together. So some people, if you play them a synth track with like one real instrument in it, they'll be like, that shouldn't be there, it's dissonant. And other people won't notice it and they'll hear it differently. So the only real answer to that is kind of think about the overall sonic space that you want to create. Like if you want it to sound full in a certain way, it will need to be produced properly and mixed. So there is no way around that. You can't kind of mush those sounds into being that. So particularly things like bass sounds, particularly things like more subtle string sounds that don't have that choppy, the thing where you have to cut the sample off before you play the next one, otherwise you get clicking with the sound chip. Like that, it's a requirement of SNES music. So if you want legato strings, and you can't do it in an authentic way. So it's difficult to know sort of without the exact details of what's going into that. But I would just say, start with the things that are most evocative, and if that is the pure sort of SNES sounds, then start with that, and then kind of build that structure around it of other things that you need. Like in snare, I think all of the more recent ones, all of the bass was, I'd have a sub bass layer that was just from, would have been V Station back in the day, or like whatever plugin it is, just a normal synth bass produced nicely so that it sits in the right frequency range, because the bass is just moving air around, so it doesn't matter if that's authentic. I think it doesn't particularly matter. And then the rest, the stuff you actually are perceiving more consciously is those sort of chiptune sounds. It's just finding the right balance of elements. I know that's sort of somewhat unhelpful, but it's
I think it's very, very helpful. Thank you. And it's and I'm not at all interested in authenticity. Like that's not any sort of a value that I'm aspiring to with this. I like it when people go hardcore with that, and they're like, I'm just doing it the old-fashioned way. And I know artists and musicians like that, and I appreciate it. But for me, like I said, I also want to make it modern. Like I want you to have a feeling like this was done in 2024 or whenever it's going to be released, but it gives you that vibe.
Maybe a sort of a clearer way of thinking about it is the hero instruments can be the SNES sounds, or they can be the main layer in the real star instrument, and then the supporting stuff can be a bit more ambiguous and a bit more modern, and that gives like the stage to those sounds, but it doesn't mean you're limited in terms of the framework of the overall mix and the overall tone of it. That's something that I've tried to do with some of the stuff I'm doing at the moment. Another thing is sort of using modern tools, but badly. So not doing the perfect key switching on strings, or like the perfect phrasing, or just like playing that sound like a chiptune sound can be something quite good as well. Because then you get the sonics of it, but you get that feeling of like maybe it's just arpeggiated in an inhuman way that a chiptune composer would do, or maybe it's cutting off at the end a lot, or other things like that, or layered with the SNES sound. So you can sort of play with those modern sounds as well, rather than just like autopiloting your strings or your brass like the way you would normally do it.
Yeah, no, and I definitely for this noticed that because I sort of went back and forth. First, I usually like to write through the sounds that I'm using. It depends on the project, because if I know I'm doing like orchestral stuff, I'll know what I'll end up doing with it. So it's fine. I write with a piano and then I orchestrate. Yeah. But with this stuff, it's so texturally specific that I can't bypass the sounds. I can't just throw a string interpretation of a line there, because it depends so much on the sample itself. Yeah. So now I'm simply going by the terms of the sounds themselves and trying to pair them together in ways that make sense. And what I've really noticed is that these sounds, and arranging music with these sounds is merciless. Like it's completely, it's non-forgiving at all, which is not something I expected, because I thought you can with SNES stuff you can throw, well, I didn't think that, but a part of me thought, okay, it's more forgiving because you can mash these bad samples in quotations, mash them together and it will sort of create this vibe, but that's not at all what happens.
It's like the second you try and make a lead sound that doesn't sound like pure ass, you're like, oh, okay, that's what they were spending all that time on. Like, that's why you get these funny panpipe, sort of trumpety panpipe lead sounds that are a bit like, huh? It's because everything else sounds like pure garbage. So it's off. You're absolutely right. Like, that's been my experience with it as well. And sometimes I just cheat and layer it with something else, and then you get a bit of that like kind of boingy trumpet or whatever it is, but there's something that can have a release tail, or like something that it sounds like a person would listen to it.
Yeah, but sometimes some of those samples are just like hauntingly beautiful isn't the right word, but they're sort of so emotionally soft and melancholic. It's sort of difficult to do that with any other type of a sound. It's like, wow, this is a real cool, and you hear like the aliasing and all the choppiness, and you're like, wow, that's super vibey.
Stuff like harp sounds, like, so those, because of the sample time, like plucky sounds with that the echo effect that they had in the sound chip is really specific. So you get the Zelda-y, fountain kind of harp thing with the little slapback echo on it. And exactly as you say, like the high end has that crunchiness, that sort of the fuzziness of the dithering, and kind of, there is something innately evocative about that. And also, I think some of those artifacts are nostalgia, because you don't hear them outside that context really. So it's sort of there's something that makes it feel like a self-contained thing.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I'll probably try and lean more into the kind of the lo-fi aspect of it a lot more. And also one of the things that I found is that I am introducing sort of more chiptune elements in there as well, because I find it sort of refreshes and oddly modernizes the sound stage of it, because the SNES sounds are sort of in not in the back, but sort of more in the middle versus up front. And when you use a bit of those curated like chip, more like Commodore 64 type of stuff,
like a pulse wave sound, like that kind of thing, you mean?
Yeah, well, anything sort of more, because they're so upfront and so sort of sparkly and alive, that it kind of is like you're sprinkling this modern something fresh, like more sort of more fresh on top of the soundstage. So I'm finding that I'm selecting a few of those here and there, and it does also pair well with the visuals of the game. So it's kind of like residing somewhere in between the two. But I would, again, another thing I would have never expected, like how do older sounds modernize this perception of
that's such a good observation, and I think it's because certainly in indie games and things like that, where they've had like an 8-bit sound, I think that sort of 8-bit aesthetic is quite, I guess, like mid 2000s, but also so kind of modern, and that is to do with like that hybridized sound having a certain tone to it. I mean, I think about stuff like Anna Managuchi, like the Scott Pilgrim stuff that they did, where it was kind of very, very hybridized, and also producers like Chipsaw. So she's done a lot of stuff with those very pure Game Boy sounds, but now kind of recontextualized, like the Dicey Dungeon soundtrack that has this kind of big band feel to it with those. The sort of it's using, and I love this because it's really using the Game Boy particularly as an instrument, as a it's like a saxophone or a guitar. It's like it's not just like, oh, it's the funny old games console. It's like, no, it is the sound of that instrument playing a lead line, and that is quite modern. And I think if audiences kind of read that as like, oh, it's like modern 8-bit style, then that's a cool thing to kind of reference as well. And it's been nice to sort of see things get to that point. Like I said, there is huge value in the kind of like, oh, I'm using a Game Boy to make music stuff. That's still important, but it's cool to see that become an instrument that has a role.
Yeah, for sure. Bridging this into before we go into inspiration, sort of more specifically, I get the impression that the music production side or the music technology side plays a part in your compositional writing process. First of all, is that true? And if so, how does that sort of bridge the world of sound into music composition?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one thing I sort of am interested in is this is how I phrase it to myself, so it may not make sense. I don't think I've ever said this out loud, but it's like the natural sound of the equipment, or the natural sound of the software. So I think software kind of often wants to be used in a certain way. Like if you take, I don't know, a synth like Yuhi Diva, which is designed to emulate, analog sounds. That when you load that up, it has that amazing preset, which just sounds fantastic. And there's thousands of deep house tracks that have that preset as the lead sound because it's so good. And that synth wants to be like this sort of super classic synth, like a Juno or Prophet or something in software form. It's not good at anything else. And so when you use that, it will take you in those, it has that plate reverb as the default reverb, it will take you in those directions. Whereas something like, I don't know, if you open a blank reactor patch, you're going to make something else with that. It's going to lend itself. So with me, I've always just really enjoyed kind of letting it do what it wants to do. And sort of not try to push against it too much. And I think that comes from being very restricted in equipment. You're trying to force things to do things that they're not supposed to all the time, and that's kind of quite frustrating. So when you get to the ability to have choice, as we do now with all of these, you can choose any synth in the world. Sort of letting it follow on it is something I like doing and I like thinking about a lot. In terms of other tech stuff, it's very I just did this soundtrack for Nights in Tight Spaces, which is the follow-up to Fights in Tight Spaces, which is the game I published a few years ago. And Nights is medieval fights. So we wanted a kind of very aggressive but yet medieval coded soundtrack. And that's why I've been talking about drum and bass production a lot. I went to drum and bass to try and get that feel of super aggressive drums and super aggressive bass, and then meld that with the orchestral sounds and the medieval stuff. Multiple people told me this was a bad idea. And,
to me it sounds awesome. Is this out already? Or
it's not out, but you can hear it in the trailers.
Okay, I need to go check that out because that sounds like something I would love. Conceptually out of the gate, I'm like, my brain for stuff like that goes like, yes, 1,000% yes. Medieval stuff with drum and bass, just do it.
It was very experimental, but that was very like it was sort of figuring out the technology. Like I wanted to make drums and bass that felt competitive with like actual records, and that's so difficult if you're not from that technical background and you're not in the scene because it's a scene that's evolving all the time as well, and if you get behind technically, you sort of sound weird. So that was a totally different thing where it was like, okay, I need to learn these techniques specifically of how these producers are doing this. Like, what is the processing they're using? How do they mix everything? How do they get that sub mid bass relationship right? Like, how do you get the movement in and so on? So that was sort of the opposite thing of like being very designed and then going down a rabbit hole of, no, I want this thing specifically for this. But yeah, left to my own devices, I think I like to use things in sort of a basic state quite a lot and not kind of work tools around something. My own sort of artist music that I produce is very like kind of computery and like based around the sound of technology kind of being a bit more exposed, which will make sense based on some of the stuff we talked about earlier. Like that's an aesthetic I really like, but it's not something that works a lot of the time for a very atmospheric soundtrack because it's very specific.
Do you always, or most of the time, do you write music through the sounds themselves that you're using, or do you ever sit down in front of a piano, or do you write from a sort of more abstracted, non-sound linked way?
I write on a piano sound a lot, especially chords. So I will kind of come up with chord sequences. I've been using a plugin called Scalar a lot, Scalar 2, which is it's very simple. It will just tell you what chord you're playing and display it. So my music theory is bad because like I said, I didn't really get on with it when I was a kid. So it's helpful to me. So I'll play a piano sound on that and it will tell you, usually what chord you're playing, and then you can kind of use that as a basis. So now when I start a track, I'll write the chord sequence out in Scalar. I'll keep the Scalar window open. I have a little mini monitor down here, and I'll just keep that open so I can see which chord is playing at which time, particularly with more complex sequences. And then I'll build up from there. Lead sounds, I think, can be quite difficult because they'll obviously have, a different kind of articulation to just the piano. So sometimes for those, I will sometimes start with piano, switch to the sound itself, and then rework. And I for particular styles, like more of a dance music style, I'll do the melody so many different times, and I'll try different things and combinations of sounds and playing and so on. But where I can, I'll use a piano and then do sound design from there.
That's really interesting. I would have expected you to, because when I listen to your music, it's again texturally very specific and very done really well. So I sort of thought it would be more linked to that, but and again, obviously that's not like it doesn't prevent you from ending up where you do, but it's at least seems like a lot more work than going, finding sounds that speak to you and sort of, having the sound of it evoke something in you and then do something in response. It's
definitely both. I mean, I think it's sort of for coming up with a song that I want to kind of have a specific type of chord sequence, a specific type of melody. I find it easier to get those considerations out of the way and just be like if it works on the piano sounds I use are terrible, so I always have to replace them. I think there's probably a couple of Nervous Test Pilot tracks where I've made them into a lo-fi thing, and that is the default piano sound. But I try to use a sound that's so bad that I want to take it out and I want to do the sound design separately. But yeah, there's also times where you find a preset or you sort of are messing around with sound design and you go oh, that naturally leads into that. But no, I'm quite. I guess I've always had a song approach to it, even if it's an instrumental piece. So I kind of think about things in terms of choruses and verses and middle eights and breakdowns and things. So I sort of know structurally the bits that I want, and I'll come up with those in abstract more.
Yeah. I'm actually super interested. Usually I like to talk about inspiration in sort of general terms, but let's start first with any artists or composers or groups that inspire you, because let's just go there, because I really don't know what the answer is going to be, and I suspect I'm going to listen to many of them because I like so much of what you do. So please do share.
So I guess we can start with. So I'm wearing my Boards of Canada T-shirt today. I don't know if that's visible on the website.
Interesting.
Boards of Canada, and a big part of my influences were Warp Records artists. So particularly Boards of Canada, Plaid is another one, sort of slightly lesser known, but I always recommend people get into Plaid. They came out of kind of a techno, early techno style, and then they went into this abstract place where there's a lot of kind of irregular, complex drum rhythms. They use a lot of very short synthesized drum sounds, and these kind of interesting, almost folk music-y chord sequences and melodies on top. So they were a huge influence to me. Was actually, I was starting to do more experimental stuff, and then a friend said, "Oh, you'd probably really like Plaid," and I listened to it. I was like, "Oh, that's kind of what I'm doing in a way, more technically advanced version of what I'm doing." And then to a lesser extent, Aphex Twin is kind of one that people bring up a lot, but that was always around. I remember hearing Come to Daddy, someone at school paid me Come to Daddy, and I was like, what is this? This is kind of non-genre electronic music. It's sort of like metal, but it's electronic, and that was really cool. I think he has, for a lot of people, kind of just opened, minds up to the fact that it doesn't have to be dance music. It doesn't have to be this and that. So that was very impactful for me, and particularly the age that kind of music was coming out. And there were other sort of more minor IDM acts around at the time. So you'd get these releases on small labels that was sort of like a lot about this very small sounding, complex sound design and very, very synthy, no vocals, like that kind of music. So I had that stuff. And then I also was into, a lot of the music that my dad liked. So blues, B.B. King, particularly. I went to see B.B. King like many times when I was younger. And that music that's very just massively emotional. The way he plays the guitar, was unique. And I think, that there's no one else who can get those guitar sounds, that particular vibrato sound that he had, the kind of high harmonic notes used to hit. The guitar, he make the guitar sing. It's a cliche, but when you hear that, you really know what that means to make an instrument sing. And I like vocal-ish sounds in instruments that aren't vocals. And I think a lot of it comes from that stuff. And then other stuff, that was around me, pop music a lot, would always have the radio on, listening to pop music. And then, of course, there's all the dance stuff. So trance was massive for me, and I've done some trance music in the past. So Ferry Corsten and Guriella and those records when they came out, sort of 1997, 98. That stuff. Less so the kind of endless, like super saw kind of trance that followed that. But there was a time when it was called Epic House for a while. So it didn't kind of have a proper name. They were using these more kind of like almost Vangelis style sounds in dance music. That had a huge impact on me. So it was like a combo of those things, kind of going through from more experimental music through to pop music. And I like to I really like melodies, and I really like, that KLF thing of like a melody you can hum in the shower. I think the book How to Have a Number One the Easy Way is a fantastic book that I kind of recommend to everyone who wants to be a musician, because it's so cynical and so joyful at the same time. And that structuring a song in that way that tells that story, that has that singable melody that stays in your head. I love that. There's nothing better than that for me. So yeah, there's a combo of things.
Yeah, well, I can definitely confirm that the melodies do stay in your head for a very long time. I just like, that's actually one of the things I love the most about the Nervous Test Pilot stuff, because not only the melody lines, but how you create the phrasing for it, the rhythm for the melody is I do a lot of stuff in the exact same way. But it's just very, very melodically rich. And again, it goes for an identifiable melody, which again would not be something that's super common in many of the other sources of inspiration that you described. So that's where the pop music stuff definitely comes into play. Not to say that pop music is the only genre that invented melodies that stay in your head, but sort of relating to especially these melodies, like I can hear a lot of influences that sound sort of East Asia to me, or sort of stuff could be maybe Japanese, but doesn't really. I would estimate Japanese sort of melodic language the most. Is that something like? Is that a valid observation, and is that a conscious thing? And if so, where does that inspiration come from?
I mean, I think it's mostly unconscious. Like it's not like I could go and point to many Japanese artists that are sort of referenced. But I would say that kind of I remember hearing the Joe Hisaishi Studio Ghibli stuff for the first time, and those chords and that sort of jazz chord in classical sensibility and there's a huge tradition of that in Japan, but it was, I think, for a lot of people like Joe Hisaishi and his work's kind of the thing that brought that to their attention. So that is there, but even before then, I mean, I guess for the snare stuff particularly, Yuzo Koshiro is a massive influence, and his Streets of Rage 2 is probably up there for my favorite game soundtracks. So that was sort of him taking contemporary house music, like quoting a lot of it. There's a lot of like melodic quotes in there from famous dance records and things like that. So it was sort of that dance music influence going through, you know, the Japanese jazz style influence kind of into there. But beyond that, it's not something that it's probably something I've picked up from, you know, listening to video game music a lot and that kind of thing, rather than being like, you know, I'm gonna particularly use this mode when I'm, you know, playing it against this key or whatever. It's not, yeah, it's unconscious mostly.
Yeah. And I notice it because it's a pretty rare way of kind of speaking about melodies. Like, again, the way you time the changes in melodies says so much. It's like an internal commentary about the story that's unfolding. It's not only the selection of notes, but when you go into them and how you patternize it. It's super, I don't know, what's the word? It's like you're sort of writing a story with that. That's what I really like about it.
This whole conversation is wonderful for my ego, man. Thank you. But there's like, again, it's sort of, that's what I'm trying to do. It's like, I don't know if I'm using this term correctly, but there's a term called voice leading, where you sort of, and I believe that means you're kind of adapting, like the chords kind of adapt around that lead line a bit. Jazz people will be like, no, that's wrong. You don't know anything about jazz. But that thing of, I love where you can play a note and you change the chord under the note, and that gives it an inflection. So I'll do a lot of stuff like, you know, hitting a higher, it's often like a fifth, probably from the root, and then try and like reharmonize that almost by shifting that chord around under that. It's something I do all the time. Like I any chance I get to do that, I love that, because it's sort of, and this melody thing's like a combo of things. Like I had a singing teacher when I was really young, and she was doing a piece with the class, and she said, this bit's difficult because the intervals between the notes are irregular. And it's always easier for you to sing things that are consecutive notes of the scale or related to each other in the scale. And that just stayed in my head so much, because trying to make these things that you can store in your brain, that it is like language, and you're trying to store things that follow on logically. And if you do like irregular intervals all the time, like that can be a cool effect, but you can't remember it. So it's a combo of that. And then there's the rhythmic thing, I think, is a lot from dance music. If you get that rhythmic phrasing wrong, and a lot of dance music has this question answer thing where it will be the same rhythm, but the melody will be doing question answer phrases. And that's really cool because it allows you to ride the melody over the rhythm. So you have this repeating groove in the melody, but the phrasing, the melodic phrasing is changing and sort of asking you things and resolving, creating tension. So yeah, it's like that's the mix of those things. I think it kind of goes into that. But no, I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that it's that vocalizing in the melody effect that I want to get. And it's just very pleasing to me. Like if I manage to achieve that sort of just for myself, I can listen to it and I'd be like, oh, that's great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're really, really at the top of doing that. And again, like what you do really masterfully is, you know, oftentimes the chord progressions themselves are very simple, but you have this ability to, first of all, make the simplicity beautiful and kind of through that simplicity create complexity, but how you move the melody around it and you play with the timing of where it lands and on what note, and creating, you know, tension and releasing it. It's just it's such a pleasure to listen to that. So, but yeah, it's really cool stuff. In terms of other inspiration, like beyond music, are there things that inspire you? What kind of things inspire you the most non-musically?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's a few things I could talk about here. I think one of them might be, I like abstract art a lot. I'm not a super, you know, art buff, but there are things like, you know, seeing like a Rothko painting or a Mondrian or like something that's, I love stuff that is abstracted from human form particularly. I think that we're kind of quite a narcissistic species. Like, we love everything to be about ourselves, and I think that art that goes away from that human element is really fascinating to me, or non-representational art sort of any kind. My grandmother was an artist, and she did these amazing abstract paintings that were very textural. So she'd do things like collect bits of wood and paint those and kind of put them together. And she was very, very accomplished at that, and never hit. My grandfather, her husband, was a commercial artist and kind of made, had a really good career and made money from doing advertising and things like that. And so in their house, there would be these beautiful representational, like super perfect things, and these like abstract kind of things. And people always assumed he did the abstract and she did the representational art. They always had to correct people. But I remember seeing these when I was growing up, and just there were big paintings, and so evocative. I mean, you could look at these things for hours and hours, and I did, sitting there as a kid, like, you look at them, and she was always trying to kind of capture a combination of different emotions in each one, and she would sort of talk about that a lot, and so that side of things, I just love abstracted things. I think they get beyond a lot of the things we concern ourselves with, and a lot of the way people process art is sort of a bit strange to me. I liked so I did English at university, and I like things like Samuel Beckett. So again, kind of more abstract, like less narrative driven, kind of somewhat weirder stuff I really liked. Writing that's kind of structurally interesting is cool to me. But also, I think I don't like things that are super opaque or super pretentious or super unforgiving that don't give people a way in. So I do get turned off by a lot of very experimental things. Like, people, if they know sort of music I like, some friends will send me like mega experimental stuff, and I'll kind of go like, I can't. There's no way in for me for this.
It's not accessible.
Yeah, so I like some way in as well. So that's sort of very specific, but yeah, I don't know if it's sort of, do I take massive influence from things outside music within music? I think it's probably it's sort of quite incestuous. Like, a lot of my music stuff is based on other musical things specifically. So I'd love to be like a more complete artist who is, I'll go and see a photograph and come back and like that's the basis of what I'm writing, but it's not often that. Having said that, I will kind of work to concept art and stuff when I'm doing game soundtracks. So maybe I am doing that, and I don't know. But to me, that's sort of, I use that to make sure I'm not straying too far outside the bounds of something that makes sense, more than like, I'm soundtracking this tree that's, specifically in the picture or whatever. Yeah.
No, and I mean, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to that. And oftentimes when it comes to inspiration, like, I personally have a very like boring answer to that, which is like, it's just life. Like, it's sometimes very difficult to separate, for an artist, to separate things that inspire you from everything. So everything is or can be inspiring to a degree. So yeah, I'm just interested in hearing how people, especially the things that they sort of consciously pay attention to or find, very clearly in certain moments inspirational. But yeah, what does like a typical, talking about your daily routine? I mean, you're writing music, you're a part of this indie game publishing company. Do you have additional work in addition to that? And what does a typical day look like for you?
So I do some consultancy work as well, which is really interesting and lets me kind of see into different things and kind of helps me, make use of some of my experience in games. So I enjoy doing that work as well. Yeah, typical day. I mean, it's pretty boring. Like, it's, I used to be really bad at starting work, so I'd have like very variable start time, and sleep has like been a huge challenge for me for my whole life for very different reasons. Some health reasons, some sort of psychological reasons. I've always been bad at sleeping, but these days I'm at my desk by 9, and then I will try and get rid of Like if admin stuff is bothering me, I will try and get that out of the way straight away. That I know that like every productivity thing in the world will tell you not to do that, but stuff just bothers me so much that I need to kind of clear that out, make sure I've got back to people who are expecting, replies from me and stuff early on. And then I'll try to move into like more concerted sort of deep work time, like 10 till 1. We'll kind of get a slot in there. And then I normally will try and have a walk at lunchtime. Where I live is sort of not the most amazing area right now, but there is like a nice kind of path you can take out to some fields and stuff. So I'll go and walk around there at lunchtime, come back, and then I'll normally go straight through until 6 or 7, and then make dinner at that point. And that routine's kind of been working pretty well for me, sort of after years of like crazy rearranging stuff. I can't work at night. I know some people do. I when I was younger, I would do all-nighters and that kind of thing, and now I'm just tired, man. Like I can't push myself too hard there. But yeah, I know sort of when I'm really in the thick of a soundtrack project, like I need that clear 4 or 5 hours in the day to really make progress on it. It's difficult. I have done stuff in little blips, but I find that really hard. Like you need to get into it properly and just be in that world of that thing for that period of time. So yeah, so that's that. But I'm just sort of getting used to things being more fragmented. And try to keep it under control. Like if I do 7-day weeks for any period of time, my mental health, really goes down. I think most people find that as well. And just trying to always have that clear, usually Sunday, I will really try and make sure I'm not working on the Sunday. My wife is a vet, so she is on call a lot. She's very busy. She has to, go in and out at weird times. So we always try to make sure our schedules like align, on a particular day, and we get to spend quality time together and relax. Yeah. So again, it's nothing kind of particularly exciting or revolutionary there. I guess it's just I'm just trying to fit everything in and get stuff done and make sure the work's of a decent quality.
How often do you, like in, let's say, an annual cycle within a year, how often are you working on a music project?
Constantly. Like I don't really stop now. I mean, there would have been times, sort of older Mode 7 times, where I'd go for a while where I'd just be focused on the game and nothing else. I wouldn't be doing music. But these days, I mean, I've gone went from Fights Inside Spaces into Banished Vault, and then into the DLC, and then into, I'm doing 3 projects at the moment. And I've tried to fit in some personal artist music kind of between those. So I've always got something, a project going in Ableton that I'll just fire up sort of when I have time. So, I kind of wish it was a bit more, I don't know, a part of me wishes it was a bit more, regimented, and I was kind of, just focused on this thing. But I've always wanted to do multiple things. And I, the thing you said about sort of, I guess, drawing inspiration from life, for me, it's not so much that it's more like I need to use my brain in a different capacity. Like if I'm just doing creative work constantly, I really want to do some commercial work and I want to do something on that side. If I'm stuck doing that, I need to go and be creative for a bit. And I've just learned that that's my brain, and I need, maybe my schedule doesn't always make sense, but I'm happiest doing that.
Yeah, it's I've talked a lot with people about the cyclical nature of like cycling through different projects and different types of work, because the worst thing is when you're writing and you get stuck and then you just, try and make it work for hours on end, when you really could have, shifted gears into something different, then come back to the music and it kind of solves itself.
I'm very big on that idea of breaking state. You can get into a great state, you can be doing well. If you're floundering and rewriting the same thing hundreds of times, or you're looping, all of that stuff, just stop. Like it's you're wasting time effectively. It would be better to go outside for 20 minutes and, just wander around or do the dishes. Like it's more productive to do anything else at that point. And I feel like I that's something I've managed to kind of get right now and internalize. Is like, there is no point just whipping that thing. It doesn't mean, certainly younger producers kind of might sometimes use that as an excuse for like, all right, I'm only going to do 30 minutes today and sort of then I'm going to do something else. And I certainly would do that of like, oh, I'm not feeling it today, like that kind of thing. And you need to get over that. I think, you need to find ways of continuing to feel it when you're not really feeling it. That's very important. And it's good to push yourself, but there's a limit to that. If you're really getting diminishing returns, then you need to stop and then you might want to come back after 10 minutes and then you'll be better. But just break the state, learn to maintain the state for a while and then break it if it's not working.
Yeah. And sorry if I missed this, but if you said like you want to block 4 to 5 hours at least of time for music, at what part of the day do you?
Yeah, so normally kind of 10 or 11 until 1, and then sort of 1, and I will go later. If I need to. I try and stop working by 9 p.m. every day, just because I need that mental decompression, and I, again with sort of sleep always being a struggle for me. Like if I go past that boundary, I'm like, I'm not going to sleep like 3 hours, and then the next day is going to be terrible. So it's those chunks really. But it gets interrupted a lot. Sometimes when I'm doing consultancy work, and that's, if I have to review a lot of materials and stuff, I will do that in the evening, because that's a nice, you can sit down and put the TV on and like, just review stuff on the laptop and prepare for the stuff you're doing. Like that can be quite a nice vibe to do as well. And I think like, it's just what doesn't stress you out. Like work shouldn't be stressful. So trying to find ways of moderating that's more important to me than time and sticking to numbers of hours or things like that. It's about finding a way that doesn't create loads of stress. Something again I've struggled with a lot, but I think I'm doing better at now. Whether my wife would agree with me on that, I don't know, but I kind of feel less stressed in myself, so that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, well, it's certainly important to figure out your own psychology when it comes to what kind of things kind of jam you up and what kind of things allow you to be more effective. I think people, especially today when there's so much content out there when it comes to productivity, it's like it's more important that you figure out you and what works for you and what sort of are good and bad triggers for you, and then build from that standpoint.
I've definitely spent time in that productivity rabbit hole and sort of thinking about, how can I get more done? And it just, the stuff that resonates with me is like, if you are doing the right stuff, you kind of don't need motivation. You sort of, you have to force yourself to sit down, focus, stay focused, reorient. If it's not, you got to push. There's effort in terms of making progress and not being too perfectionist or not cutting corners. But if you're in that rhythm, you don't need to kind of do a motivational exercise to make you do the work. I find if you're lucky enough to find work that's kind of relevant to you. And I'm always motivated by trying to make music that gets a good reaction from people. If it's a soundtrack, like it's usually for, the devs, if they're happy and they really like it and then their audience likes it, then that's, job done. If it's my own stuff, it's, people in my community like it, or it, I can see the stats on Spotify, like they listen to it and you can see it working. So that's the thing that's kind of driving that musically. And that's never going to go away, like independent of financial concerns or sort of anything else. Like that's the motivation for doing that. And then other stuff is just really hard and it's boring, and you've got to come up with coping strategies for not getting bored. But the abstracted productivity stuff, I think, is a bit, a lot of that's not great and can often make you feel inadequate and sort of, it's like you're not taking enough cold plunges and all that kind of thing. It's like, everyone's different. You've got to figure it out for yourself, I think.
And it can definitely become a trap where you find yourself kind of doing work, trying to stick to this, productivity routine, but it's sort of sucking away time and focus and effort from other things. And again, I'm not against those things at all. Like if they work for you, they give you a good flow, then for sure do them. But
I think like another thing is like it's this balance of being kind to yourself, and like maybe you had a crappy day, you didn't get stuff done. Okay, that's fine. Like reset, just be kind to yourself, do it again. And then you can be way too kind to yourself and like have no discipline and not, just let everything kind of go out the window, and because you feel tired or you feel bad or whatever. And I think that a lot of that content portrays people as having solved that, and the answer is that no, all of those people are fighting with that. Like they're either being some of the most disciplined people you come across are really judgmental of themselves and beat themselves up, and they do it from this very negative perspective, and then some of the most relaxed people get loads of stuff done because they're like low stress and they don't feel the risk and they don't feel the anxiety as much. So it's all very like it's not as clear cut as I think it can be made to seem.
Yeah, for sure. Touching on the sleep issue, without going into any specifics in terms of the issues you had, what is there something that, because I know that there are a lot of insomniacs and people who suffer from all kinds of sleep issues in the creative field of people. Have you found something that has helped you the most when it comes to improving your sleep?
I've tried so many things. I mean, so some of it's health related for me, and that's sort of difficult to deal with. So a lot of it's like managing my health and sort of making sure that stuff is under control. And then it's just like basic stuff of like try to have a regular routine is really important. That's when I've had the best sort of run of it. Stuff like not eating too late, I think is like a big one for me now, and I don't always achieve that. But if I have like a light meal like quite early, I think that can help really well. And then secondary to that, it's trying to not ruminate on stuff when you should be relaxing and trying to fall asleep is something that I think it takes practice to do that. I've been really, really bad at that at times, and then just like right now, it's kind of going better for me. I don't find that I'm needing to process stuff as I fall asleep. And weirdly, a function of that is like I am doing so much at the moment that I will start thinking about it and go like, there's no point thinking about this, and I'll just fall asleep. So it's really hard. I don't have a good answer for other people who have these issues. I think one thing for me has been being frustrated that my sleep is bad can spiral into a lot of, then you're angry and annoyed that you're not sleeping, and then you don't sleep more. And that's a good thing to cut off. Like if you find yourself going, I'm so stupid, like why am I not sleeping well? Why have I allowed this to happen, kind of thing. If you're doing that behavior, that's like, just throw that out straight away. That's not going to help you. And it's not good. So just sort of taking it as it comes is quite good. And you feel more relaxed then, and you're probably going to get better quality sleep. So anyone else who has these issues, it's hard. it's difficult, and you just got to try different tactics to see what works.
Yeah, and I think that's actually what you mentioned there is super important, because people tend to be very focused on how can I improve this situation or this condition. What you said about getting frustrated about it not working, what you're actually doing is making it worse. So the starting point, and you're probably doing a bunch of things that's making it worse. So it's better to start by removing the things that are actively and continuously making it worse, instead of trying to stack on top things that are making it better. Yes. So that's probably a good place to start, and you will also already see the improvement at that point, and then you can talk about optimization in a sort of positive, beyond positive direction.
Yeah, I always think if you're making an effort, that's all you can do, and even if the effort isn't achieving what you want, it's just focusing on continuing to make the effort rather than judging instantly, like, have I had the result I want straight away? That's kind of everything really, is making a good faith effort, evaluating it, going like, is this working? Is this not working? What can I change about it? Not, I tried and it didn't work, I'm bad, which is a cycle that's so easy to get into that. I think everyone does that. Even very confident people do that. And with something like that, where it's personal, it's even more important to have that attitude, I think, if you can maintain it. And then if you fall out of that, not judging that as well, not going like, I'm thinking badly again, I'm a bad person. It's just catching yourself doing that stuff, I think, is important.
Yeah. And also realizing that, because we tend to be so locked in the here and now. So if I mess up something now, I'm, the temptation is to throw everything into the, trash bin.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a tomorrow and next week and next month, and it's okay to suck today. Just, you can write off today. It's fine. This day is, whatever it is, but I can try again tomorrow and next week. And that's an important thing to remember, that the time horizon is longer than just the next few hours. And, same applies to if you're trying to make any changes in your diet. It's okay to, if you had an ice cream today, but try and be better tomorrow and next week. And don't beat yourself up over those, mistakes.
That one specifically is it's so easy to go like, oh, I cheated on my diet. All is lost. Now I can just eat what I want. It's so easy to do that.
Yeah.
And it's just that, restart the effort tomorrow is such a great way to do it. I wish I was consistent at that. And I that's one thing I aspire to be, is sort of more consistent at making effort for things. But it's just hard. It's hard.
Yeah, no, it's definitely tough work. And again, I think, creatives overall tend to be sort of more, prone to making the hasty decision in the here and now, because tend to be emotional, more impulsive people. And, so it's useful to think about those things. Talking about sort of mental negative thoughts, in terms of the creative process, let's say you're writing something and it's not working out, and you I don't know if you get these thoughts, but you can modify this question in any way you find to be more appropriate to you. But let's say you're writing music and it's not working out, and you start thinking like, well, this sucks, why am I doing this, like I shouldn't be doing music at all, etc. Like any kind of negative thoughts that you have in the creative process when it's not working. Do you have any tips, any tools, anything you do yourself to sort of modulate or change your mindset when it comes to negative thoughts?
So I get most negative about production and engineering stuff, actually, where I can't get something to sound right. The way I think about that is, it's just very frustrating. So you're going to get frustrated. And that then all the stuff I said before comes back in terms of breaking out, trying again. So we cover that. I think one thing that really helped me is even the best artists who are the most technically fantastic really struggle to make things sound the way they want. Like if you watch, I just really recommend, watching streams of people, any videos that people put out. There's a fantastic producer guy called Mr. Bill, he's a dubstep producer, but he does a lot of other things. He's just an awesome person generally. And one of the things that he does that's so good is he makes these courses that are just him making an entire track start to finish, like over the course of a week. There's hours and hours and hours and hours of footage of him doing stuff and explaining what he's doing. And he has to redo stuff all the time. Like he'll make a sound at the start of the project and get to the end and throw it out and like have to redo it. There's one of his courses that I watched. He's trying to master the track and he can't get it loud enough. And he's like, oh no. And he has to go back and he's referencing all of these things that beginner producers do. You find yourself referencing against a track. You're like, oh, this sound doesn't sound as good as that. Like I can't get it loud enough. Even the people who are doing that are doing that every time. So it's just remembering that you're not bad if you can't achieve the thing straight away. A lot of the most amazing stuff you've ever heard, they'll have spent months on that snare sound and tried and reworked it and bought new plugins and not used them and tried again. And like, it's just the process is just that. It is getting frustrated. If you're frustrated because it doesn't sound good enough, you've unlocked the ability to perceive that it's not sounding the way you want and that you're making progress through the frustration. And sort of trying to internalize that and not turn it into negative self-talk and like, oh, I suck and like I should be better at this by now and blah, blah, blah. That's the thing to do, is like harness that in the right direction. And I went through this recently with that Nights project. I started trying to do it and trying to do these, the drum and bass drums and things like that. It just didn't sound very good. And it it didn't hit in the right place. And particularly kick drums I found really hard in that genre. Trying to do a hybrid acoustic electronic kick drum that punches in the right zone that sits with those bass sounds, really, really tough. And I had to unlearn a load of stuff because it's different in that genre. The kick drums are like these little short, weird things that sit higher up than like a house kick drum or anything like that. So it's that resistance kind of proves you're going the right way and that you're learning. And if you can remember that, very tough to remember it. But if you can, then you're doing okay, I think.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps the single most powerful thing you can be thinking about. Because like you said, I know so many people who, me including, but less so hopefully these days, that, you know, you're working on something and you're like, this sucks. And you're supposed to think like, good, like you're on the track. Like this is a very positive thing, because
I think good is so powerful. Like if you can turn around and be like, I made garbage, good. Like, you know, maybe I'll make not garbage next time. Then yeah, you've won already. Like it's I find people like, they will either judge and blame themselves or they'll judge and blame their circumstances or other people. And I think both are really bad. And just, you know, you need to kind of modulate a bit between them. Like maybe everything isn't your fault. Maybe it's just hard, or maybe something bad happened to you and it's not your fault, or maybe it's not this person's fault or this situation's fault. Maybe it's you. Maybe you could put more effort in and try. So it's like it's adjusting these things. But anything where you spend time caught up in like anything other than just making a good faith effort to do the thing, is you need to just take some time and get out of that state, I think.
Yeah. And it's, again, creating music is so elusive and complicated and difficult. Usually, like, think less about what is the right thing to do and just focus on doing something different, something new. Because like, if a snare isn't working, spend the next hour trying different snares. Like that's better than trying to turn something that isn't working into something half decent.
Yeah,
that's like you said, going back to the sound sources,
stacking plugins on top of it and trying to like. I've done that so many times, and it's because it's hard to admit defeat. I think sometimes you're like, I can just hear it if it just does this, and you're so right. Like often it's just delete the channel, put a new thing in, and then it's all, you know, it all works out. But these are just, I think they're just experience things that you pick up on, you know, over time, and it's difficult to kind of convey that to someone maybe who's starting out, of just like nothing works, like nothing makes sense. There's the really great records that you like, half of the stuff in them is going to be a mistake or like, you know, it's so hard to believe that, because you hear this amazing stuff and you're like, these are super genius people who are brilliant, and often they're just like weird nerds who've stayed in their house for longer than you have, and that boils down to that. So you're not going to compete with that until you've done the same amount of time, or, you know, you've obsessed over the things in the same way. So just enjoy that and don't worry about what they're doing over there, I guess.
Yeah, and oftentimes what they did was that they took more chances. They were more open to trying out something.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of, like, when I step into the studio, I never know what's going to happen today. Like I never, and I embrace that. Like I tell myself, Markus, you don't know what you're gonna, you know, walk out of the studio with today, because you just don't know. Because if you keep trying, you keep testing, even on days where like, yesterday was so shit and I made no progress, and these tracks still sound like shit. It's still like, even on those days, I'm like, well, I can do that one magical thing that sparks my imagination and creativity. And then I can, like, you can be walking out of the studio with this thing in your head and you're like, this is the best track ever. And of course, tomorrow, the day after that, it's going to be like, maybe not the best track ever, but maybe, you know, top 1,000, and then it drops to 10,000, and then it's shit again, and and it on and on it goes.
It's the roller coaster. Yeah.
Talking about like your sound choices, as we've touched on already, you put a lot of emphasis into that. But talking about it sort of more going into the kind of hardware, software side of it, are there any sort of notable mentions that sort of come to mind? Something you go back to repeatedly, or something you especially want to, praise or give credit to?
I've got to shout out, well, firstly, Ableton Live. I mean, I've been using Ableton Live since version 1. I remember having a conversation with a very experienced producer who was like, you can't make a full track in Ableton Live. That's crazy. Like, you should be using a real DAW like Cubase or Pro Tools or something. And I was like, I bet you haven't used it for a few years. And I showed it to him. It's like, oh, okay. So that company they are so committed to their users. They want their software to be usable. They want to add practical things that people actually use to make music. They've been so consistent. They haven't gone down any of the sort of more pernicious pricing routes or anything like that. They just delivered a really consistent product. I've reported bugs to Ableton that have been deep in there for many iterations, and they've eventually fixed them and communicated with me about that. And I just love them as a company. That they're so good, and without that software, I wouldn't have a career, I think. So super cool. And then another recent thing is Kiloheart's Phase Plant, which is a modular synth kind of environment. And this unlocked modular for me, really. I'd sort of struggled with things like Reactor and Max MSP and stuff like that before. And Phase Plant just makes it so logical, and the way that they've, the UI work that they've done. I'm lucky enough to be really good friends actually with one of the devs now, and his approach to that is so kind of, they wanted to go away from like skeuomorphic synth design where everything's like tiny knobs and buttons to make something that really suits a mouse-driven interface that makes sense. So that's seen in, and they have amazing presets as well. This is turning into a Phase Plant commercial, but I don't care. I love it, and they're great people. The preset library for that is fantastic. Presets are all over the Fights and Tight Spaces soundtrack. Is a massive number of Phase Plant presets because they're so cool. They've got really, really good banks by proper producers who work in those genres. So love that synth. Everyone should try that. Just trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, it's just, then it becomes like a load of other stuff that I've picked up over the years. And for the snare stuff, I love Plogue. There's a developer called Plogue, French guy. You've probably come across this, but I think I own everything that he's made, and he is Mr. Authenticity. He has amazing videos about recreating the sound chips, which are really worth watching. And so I love those. Again, that was in snare, was kind of the sound of, as soon as Plogue chip sounds came out, I was like, right, this is my instrument for chip music. I'm just gonna rinse this thing to death. So those are probably the big ones.
Yeah, so you're mostly in the software world. Do you have any hardware synths or
so
like that?
I had when I was doing Frozen Synapse 2, I kind of acquired a load of sort of late-ish 80s, early 90s kind of bad digital synths. So I had like a Roland D550, Yamaha DX100, and then things like an EMU Orbit, and like these Rompler, kind of gnarly Rompler things I really like. I've never been into like the super, the purist analog stuff particularly. I've always liked the kind of weirder digital things. And now I had to move into a smaller place, so I got rid of a load of that stuff. And at the moment, I'm just kind of looking around me. I can, one second. I love this one. This is the Soulsby at Megatron, made by my good friend Paul Soulsby. And this is it's a unique at Mega chipset based synthesizer. So things like that, small things that are unique, I really like. I've got it's called a Mega FM down here, which is another sort of, it's the Mega Drive sound chip, like a couple of them kind of in an enclosure with it's Twisted Electrons of the company. That's really cool. So yeah, I have little bits of sort of some synths around, but mostly software these days just for practical reasons. I'd love to have a big space filled with junk, but life has not turned out that way.
Yeah, and that also puts a lot of demands on the workflow setup stuff, because once you have hardware, you need to plug it in a way that's fast to use. Well, you don't need to, but you probably should.
Yeah, and also coming from, so a lot of my early stuff was mixed on the outputs of a hardware sampler, so I had to kind of just work with that stuff and MIDI cables everywhere, and like now it is quite nice to have everything in the box. and the standards thing. I think for like mega purist analog stuff, there is still a lot of value to hardware. And I think, having said that, you do hear a lot of music that just, you're like, that's a Prophet, that's a Mini Moog, like that's this, and lo and behold, like you see the studio tour, it's like, oh, it's the Prophet again. So that stuff I think can be quite limiting. But I think there's really good value in that. If you're that sort of producer who needs that sound, there's still a lot of value in hardware. There's some stuff that's hard to model well, I think, still.
Yeah, well, it's all about self-awareness and knowing what you'll actually use and benefit from. And like I don't have a single piece of hardware, synth or anything else. Like everything I have is on this desk, so everything is integrated into this desk. And this is the only that's a Yamaha KX5 keytar, which is the only extra piece of hardware that I have.
Amazing.
It's just because it's so cool, and it has an amazing key bed. It's so responsive and fast. But yeah, I mean, I went all software because I want things to be in and out super fast.
Yeah.
And also I want to get it out of sight if I don't want to see it. So I want everything to be like a blank canvas when I come here and do work. And yeah,
no, it's nice. Yeah.
So do you mix all of your own music?
Yeah. Yep. I didn't. So the only things I did with another person were with that guy Pete Richardson, sort of in 2005, 2006, when I was learning dance music production. So he would do all the mix of those. And then since working with him, I tried to learn more and more myself and kind of get to the point. I would say that, I have done some commercially released dance music that I've mixed myself, and I see that as like, that's probably the most challenging thing to do, because the sound engineering in that realm is so competitive. So I'm sort of at the level where I can do that, but I definitely am not competing with the best, people in that field by any stretch of the imagination. So the way I kind of think about my level of ability to do it is, I can make stuff that sounds good enough to my ear that I am personally happy to listen to it, and it's not getting in the way of what I'm trying to convey. But wouldn't put myself up there at all with, really top mixing people in any field, really. But it can be kind of diminishing returns when you get up there anyway. That's what I tell myself.
Well, no, it definitely does. I mean, it's like if you can nail it, or get to a certain percentage, it's like the effects beyond it become minimal, at least to the general public. So
and there's super specialist stuff like recording and mixing an orchestra, or like that's a real art form that's different. So I'm not sort of talking about that.
No, yeah, absolutely. And it's also, you have to ask, like, am I going to put that time into becoming a better songwriter or composer or a mixing engineer? So we all have to make our decisions regarding that. What does your, like, we touched on a bunch of this stuff. I get the sense that your mixing process is, well, I get the sense you try and stay sort of simple and minimal and not destroy the good sounds that you've already sourced. But you also described, meticulous, technical processes as well. So how would you describe your mixing process overall?
I mean, it depends on the project, but let's take, like, if I'm doing let's take like a Nervous Test Pilot sort of personal track, it's probably the easiest thing to do. So I will start with key drums. So that kind of comes from the dance music background. So I'll get the kick and the clap or snare, right? And the kick will sit at -6 kind of on the meters. And for years, I'd see people do different things, like leaving headroom, and like, now you're not supposed to leave headroom and you're supposed to clip everything. And I had to stop changing that, because I was putting it in different places, and now it just is at -6, and that's where the kick drum hits. And then from there, I will kind of, now I'm much more sensitive to, like, is it the right kind of kick drum? What does the transient of the kick drum sound like? Is it too long and boomy? Like, what's the genre I'm making? I think kick drums really define, the whole genre. So I will pay a lot of attention to that. I mean, we can cover, however much you want to cover, but there's a
No,
huge.
I know it's a bit of a unfair question, but I mean, for my part, go as long as you want. But obviously, I don't want to take up the rest of your day.
I'll try and keep it general to start with, and then we can kind of pick up. So getting those key drums right is sort of probably the first mixing thing I do, and then bass. Another thing I struggle with for a long time. The way I deal with bass is I tend to pick like one of two, well, maybe one of three styles of bass. So I have a mostly sine wave bass, which has a little bit of a harmonic in there. And that's something I got from Mr. Bill has a video about this. I think it's called Making Super Fat Bass or something. He's put stupid titles to his videos, but he came up with a sine wave bass that has this slight higher harmonic in it that just makes it sound a little bit bigger than a pure sine wave. A lot of the time, a pure sine wave bass feels it's more perceived than heard, and this just adds a little bit of audible harmonics to that. So I'll use that one for sub, or a rolled off sawtooth wave with sometimes like a bit of processing on it. Maybe I used to use Waves R bass a lot to just add harmonics to that. Now I'll just do it myself with some EQ or a bit of saturation. And then the other type I tend to use is like a shorter, pluckier sawtooth wave, usually from kind of a Roland synth. I think it's called the SH2 or something like that. I've forgotten the exact name of it, but there's an analog Roland emulated synth that I use for those shorter, more housey kind of bass style. And that's it. So those are kind of the three bass sounds, and I find those sit really well. And then I will always sidechain the bass to the kick. I don't have time to. I have worked with people who are able to like harmonically configure the two to sit together. I don't care. I just duck it out the way. Usually with either a compressor if I'm doing it with audio, or a plugin called Gatekeeper, which is just a bit like LFO tool, MIDI triggered little ducking thing. Once I got those things. Sorry.
Have you? No. I just wanted to ask relating to that. Have you tried the Waves Factory track spacer?
Yes, I really like that. Okay. I don't use that for bass versus kick because I kind of want to be more brute force with it, because it's, the fundamental is all sine waves. So you've got the low fundamental of the kick and you don't need it. For complex material, absolutely. I use that a lot on the Nights in Tight Spaces thing to kind of carve out some space for lead sounds in the bigger mix and things like that. Really useful plugin. I find the GUI lags quite a lot on my computer. So if I open it, everything will like chug visually. I don't know why that is. So sometimes that puts me off using it, but the sound of it is good. Very, very handy. So that and I will other elements I will take out the low end quite a lot. There's been sort of debate over whether you should do that, and like how sharp should the EQ curve be, and does it cause phase disruption in that. And I'm just like, I don't care. Like if it's clashing with those low frequencies, like if it's a very boomy sound, I just want that out of the way and it sounds better to me. So I don't care if I'm phase rotating the subharmonic partials, whatever, no one cares. So that's that. And then I don't tend to do like a massive amount of compression or anything like that on sort of the main musical sounds. I kind of tend to let them float around. If it's stuff like pianos or guitars or real instrument sounds, I'll do sort of the conventional things there. But if it's synth sounds, I'll often just let them exist. I use transient shaping more than compression, so I use Kilduff-Taylor's transient shaper on a lot of things, and that I find that gives me lots of control. And then just try and get the balance sounding right. I will mix through a limiter quite a lot of the time now. I'll put a basic limiter on to get that feel of how limited everything is. Take it off. For super loud music, I'll go back in and clip all the channels. So I'll use something like Newfangled Saturate as a clipper. Go in and aggressively clip everything. That's for getting really mega loud, like punchy dance mixes. And if it's a more dynamic mix, I just won't bother. I won't do that. And so that's just the general structure of it, really. Nothing really complicated. Bass level tend to just sit that behind the kick a little bit most of the time. Snare or clap just slightly lower than the kick, I find tends to work quite well. Snares are they can be very dynamic, and you have to look at loudness with them versus the spike of that initial attack stage. So I would say beyond the kick and bass stuff, don't set too many rules for yourself of like how to build up the track. Trying to think of anything else general. High end is hard. that's about finding EQs that you like and sound choices that deliver that sort of nice, sweet and present high end without it being harsh. So that's a real thing to work on. Referencing against other tracks is something I should have brought up at the start, but I'm always doing that. Finding a track in the genre that I'm in, referencing different frequency ranges from it. So just putting a high pass on it and listening to the hi-hats and trying to get your hi-hats to sound like that. Ride cymbals, trying to get them there. Yeah, it's nothing super complicated. I've definitely found that sort of trying to get that overall, thinking about the mix as a whole and not mixing individual instruments too much is really important. So, you know, if you have a very bright lead sound, you may not need as many top end like shakers or hi-hats that might fill that range out for you, or you might want to do something else. But tracks seem to be very defined by how the high end is shaped and how the very low end is shaped. And I think if you get both of those right for your genre, for your style, then you're in a good place generally.
For the high end that is, you know, opens it up nicely but doesn't create that harshness, do you have like a specific approach or method or even specific EQ that you use for that?
So there's a Softube like Pultec emulation that I use sometimes for that. That's quite good. Oftentimes it's just an annoying process of getting the right hi-hat sound, getting the level of that. I tend to think about that as level a lot more than just EQ, because if you're EQing too much in, it gets weird. But it's something to think about with that is there's a lot of high boosting in most records that you hear now. Like, it's very rare to hear something that doesn't have that in there. I know people use exciters like the Ozone stuff a bit. I've not really found anything there that I really like. I've tried a couple of things, but I use Pro Q3 a lot as again a EQ that everyone knows, but it's just nice and detailed. And sometimes I'll just stick the Ableton stock EQ and like put a boost on it and it sounds okay and leave that. I use Soothe a fair amount to kind of correct if I've sort of overdone it a bit. But then you can get into like a war of Soothe versus EQ versus levels, and you've got to be a bit careful. The thing I found that helped the most really is just using a good spectral analyzer like Span or Vision 4X is quite good. That has some nice spectral analysis stuff in it, and you can actually see, you know, reference against another track, think about the loudness of that track, and then sort of think about where your high end needs to be positioned. That's very helpful. Listening on different headphones, I think, is really good for high end. So I have some monitoring headphones and then some commercial, just like noise cancelling headphones, and they sound totally different, totally opposite in the high end, and that's really helpful if like you can figure out where that sweet spot is. I haven't found a good substitute for agonizing over it and tweaking for high end. There's no one, you know, solution.
So the solution is suffer.
Yeah, it's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. In the sort of tech front, is there like well, actually, before we go into that, when it comes to mixing, has there been like a big aha moment for you at any point, like one approach or one trick or something that made you sort of unlock the next level for your mixing? And what was that, if at all?
It's the thing I just was referencing, which is looking at loudness. So getting a meter like Ulene that will show you a LUFS level, and then learning to use Span. Like, a lot of people will get these analyzers. I mean, because I certainly did this, and you just think, oh, it's these lines moving up and down, and like my line is roughly in the same place, and that's good. But you need to understand that loudness and the level on the spectral analyzer are correlated. So obviously, if the overall track's louder, the high end is going to be higher on Span. So you need to find references that are the same loudness range that sound, you know, roughly like you want them to sound, and then you need to be relative to that. So you don't need to match everything like perfectly. You need to think, okay, this is a slightly more relaxed track. I can sit back on the highs a little bit, or this is more hype and I want more energy, and I'm just going to take that up a little bit there. So the absolute best thing you can do for mixing, I think, is to set up a project with lots of different tracks in that you think sound good anytime. And I still do this. If I hear something on Spotify and I go, oh, that mix is amazing, I'll just record a bit of it into Audacity and put it in that project, and then put Ulene and Span on it and some other analysis things, and then listen to it, but also look at what they've done. loudness is so important, because louder things sound brighter. So you get this relationship. So I'd say that the one thing that's made the biggest difference for me is actually detailed listening to a variety of stuff that I think sounds cool, and then empirically understanding what the cool factor is in all of these things and why that works. That's just so valuable. I wish I'd done that years ago. I didn't get into all the analysis stuff because I was quite intuitive, and I sort of like, oh, I don't need that. I'm just going to make it sound good. But this tells you what you're doing, and then that's how you learn, is becoming conscious of what you're doing and changing it.
Yeah. What about, is there like a piece of kit? This could be a plugin, this could be a virtual instrument, could be anything in the world of music tech. Something that you've been, something that you're currently really excited about or find very interesting. Does anything come to mind?
One thing I really want to use more is Synplant too. That has that AI patch creation thing. So Synplant's kind of like a complex FM synth, but you can give it a sound and it will try and make the sound out of its own stuff. And it will also give you like its failed attempts. So it's making all these weird kind of FM burps and gurgles and weird stuff going on. I got that when it came out, and I was like, this is great. And I just haven't had time to play with it yet. So I'd like to try that more. I'm definitely interested in some of the AI stuff in terms of how it allows for really weird, like broken sounding spectral mess. If you listen to a lot of the AI kind of music creation, it creates these really weird spectral artifacts. And I think some of those sounds are interesting. And you can already hear like some of the bass music producers are doing more spectral stuff, like the color bass kind of music has these spectral effects in it. So that's an area that I'm kind of interested in exploring a bit more sound design wise, some of this wackier spectral stuff. In terms of other stuff, plugins coming out, I'm sort of, there's a huge amount going on in that scene now. I mean, again, not to plug too heavily, but I've seen some of the upcoming Kiloheart stuff. It's very exciting, and I'm kind of looking forward to that. So that will just plug nicely into that ecosystem that I'm in now. But outside that, I always feel like I don't have enough time to play with the things I have already. So the number of plugins I've bought outside Contact sound libraries, which is every game composer out there knows, you think you've got enough, and then the client will say, oh, I'd really like to have this obscure instrument in this, and you go, I haven't got a library for that, and you have to wait for Black Friday. And then so that's the thing I add most of now, is real instrument sample Contact libraries, which is a thing I tried to avoid for a huge amount of time, but now I'm sucked into that world. That's where all my money goes. I have a positive issue in the sense I do demo reviews of sample libraries mostly on YouTube. Nice. So right now I have more than I have time to familiarize myself with, but it's obviously a very good issue to have. Obviously, I do spend time on that, which is taken away from composing, which isn't great. But it's a good way of staying up to date on what's out there, and very nice. I just try and make demos the way I want to, what I would want to see and hear when it comes to that. So it's hopefully, because when you get a library, you're going to go through it anyway. So I just do that on film and share it with people, and hopefully. What's the best recent one of those you've had? Like, give me your hot tip for Contact sample libraries. Do you have any? I gotta open my YouTube for that. Do you have anything specific you're interested in or looking for? Yeah, kind of, esoteric string stuff would be nice at the moment. I don't know if you've got anything for that. Esoteric. I don't know if there's a company called Fracture Sounds. They're in UK. In the UK, they're to me like on a very upwards trajectory. Like they've always been good, but they're just getting better and better. They made a library called String Formations, which is basically like alternative articulations. It's all like special sort of fluttering and motion and this kind of stuff.
string formations is like super good for me. And the deeper you go into the library, the better it gets. Because you'd think it gets a bit repetitive after you have, I don't know how many does it have, maybe like 4. I can't count, but it has a lot of different articulations. You'd think it would get repetitive, but they don't. They did a really good job with that one. So strings, I'd probably say that one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, check that out. Sounds good.
Yeah, it's definitely a really good company to check out. Also, you didn't ask about vocals, but you said anything comes to mind. There's a company called Void and Vista, and they have this library called Folds, which is like, it's vocal samples, but they're processed in very interesting, like manipulative, mangled, modulated way. So, like very, very cinematic, very dark. I think you might enjoy that. I was super impressed by them. I never heard about this company, but they reached out and I checked it out, and they're actually one of my favorite developers now. So,
thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't done that stuff. The older soundtracks had a lot of East-West voices of passion on. That was the thing that people would always ask me, what's that from? And I love things like that are just unusual vocal performances, or I don't have much kind of manipulated stuff. There's an output one I have, which I think is like, it's kind of okay. But I'll check that out. Thank you. It's cool.
Yeah, no, I think it might be down your alley. Briefly touching on like work-life balance, if there is even such a thing. I need to reformat this question because I don't like the whole term myself. But in terms of balancing your creative work, whether it be on the business front, if you want to think about that as creative, I do. But anyway, balancing your creative work, whatever that may be, music, with the rest of your life, have you found finding that balance to be easy and natural? Or if not, what has been like the biggest thing you've had to figure out, and how did you solve for that?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think some of this comes back to, a lot of the stuff we were talking about earlier. I think a friend of mine gave me some advice recently, and I was talking to him about how do you deal with, he runs like very, very complicated games projects. I said, how do you deal with stress? And he said, well, I try not to think about tomorrow's problems today, and I write things down. Those were his 2 tips. And the thing about not thinking about tomorrow's problems today was really huge for me. Actually, it's like a very simple kind of phrase, but it just is. It's like, yes, that's the right thing to do. Is focus on stuff that's immediately apparent. So I've been trying to do that more, and I think that allows for being more present when I'm not working. I used to really struggle to go on holiday. I used to think I didn't like holidays, and my wife, thankfully kind of would convince me to do it. And I realized that I was also having a negative effect on her, because she really wants to, like, her job is very intense, like very long hours, and she needs holiday, like massively complete break to get away. And I was sort of being negative about it was not good for her, and I realized that as well. And now I love holidays. Like, I happily go on holiday and just not think about work and switch off, because I feel like I've sort of been lucky enough to work on quite a few interesting things in my career, and that's, nothing can take that away. So I don't feel like I have insecurity about like, oh, I need to do all of these things. It's sort of, no, I'm very lucky that I've been in a position to do some things, and I kind of remembering that and going, yeah, I'm working on stuff now, but if I'm on track with that and it can wait, and spending time, is important. Seeing friends has become really important to me, especially since the pandemic, and obviously, a lot of people had this experience of being more isolated then and not catching up with friends. A lot of friends are kind of having kids now, and sort of, or have had kids, and their kids are growing up, and it's important to kind of get them, to be themselves, and sort of, we can remember, growing up together and things like that, or that's really important. And then those times are really, really important to me, and they don't last forever, is something I'm very aware of, seeing my parents, obviously they're older now, and they've lost friends, and sort of, there's lots of issues, and people can't always see each other, and they're in different places. So trying to remember just how important that is, and that's the stuff you miss when you're older. is good. But it's always hard. Like I get very caught up with work. I do want to think about work a lot. I gain a lot of satisfaction and motivation in my life from work. So it's just making sure that doesn't take over absolutely everything. And just remembering how you feel at those great times when you're not working is important. But that's another one where I don't think I always get it right.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier about these time periods of not creating and how you notice that it has a very negative effect on you. How long do you find that you can be away from creative work before you begin to see any symptoms, so to speak? And how do you notice that this is that this is what is causing it? And I think this is super important because a lot of people might be going through these symptoms, not really realizing that they are, first of all, maybe creatives, but even if they know that, they can still, find that they are angry or frustrated and in a bad place. So maybe it can help some people notice, what's up.
I would say it's probably around the 2-month mark. Like if I've been really focused on other things or kind of pull away, and then that I'll start to notice it. And the way it manifests will just be feeling like I am floating around in this void of obligations, and that my life is just becoming obligations of things I have to do and things I have to take care of, and that there isn't any, I'm not. I guess it might be self-expression. I think the idea of self-expression is kind of a bit limiting, and it's something that people fall back on a lot, because I think you can and you should express yourself in ways other than just your work. But there is an element of that as well. It's like there's a part of me that's not speaking right now, that's not engaged, and it's a lot of it's that feeling of like I need to be making things because a big part of what I want to put into the world is things I've made personally that have these qualities that I think should be in the world. So it's sort of, that's the combination of feelings. And sometimes it will just sort of slip in as like just feeling generally a bit miserable and just a bit unhappy, and like, why I'm not firing on all cylinders kind of thing. And then you think, well, I haven't really been able to exercise that muscle for a while. And if people are feeling that, I think it can be remedied quite easily by just having a little bit of time on it, even just an hour or, something and then you started something, and then, once you've got something started, that will nag at you and you'll have to finish it at some point. So, I think like creating an open loop there that needs you to be creative to fill it can be quite good.
Yeah. Good. In terms of the future, what's next in store for you? Obviously you mentioned the game, is it DLC or additional content, and also the new music? But sort of, what's on the horizon for you? What's up next?
So Nights in Tight Spaces is finished. That is, I submitted final masters for that yesterday, actually, after tweaking some stuff for a while. So that's all done. I would love to do more for that project if they'll have me. I don't know if that's going to be the case. I'm currently working on 3 soundtracks, which is the most I've done simultaneously, and those all should be wrapped up by probably March, April next year. So I've got those going. There's a development project I'm working on again, which is interesting, and that should see the light of day hopefully in a couple of months, and some other stuff. So beyond that, I'm not really thinking about anything. That's such a lot to kind of have going on at once that I'm just sort of thinking about how am I going to get all of that done and sort of in a sensible way. I think I've got a plan, but
just holding on to dear life.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond that, I would love to do I'd like to do another artist album, like another Nervous Esquire artist album. The last one I did, which I think was like 2021 or 2020 or something like that, felt very fulfilling to do. And it was really nice to kind of advance that forward. So that's something that it tends to get bumped along by opportunities that come up. And then I think, I need to build in time to do that. So that's something that I really hope I get time to do, probably, tail end of next year. Yeah, and beyond that, definitely game development has come back in a big way. So I'm sort of moving away from the publishing side a little bit. If I find things, that I want to support, I will. But generally, I'm working with some people on development, and we're hoping that will turn into a more sustainable thing again. So that's where I think a lot of my effort's going to go. But yeah, big mix of things as usual.
Yeah, I mean, indie games are in a super interesting place right now. There are so many moving factors, and
yeah, it's a good. I think it's a good time for indie games, and I'm increasingly finding that, and this is not to deny that there's massive challenges in the industry, and certainly at the high end of the industry, there's lots of layoffs and that kind of issue, which is devastating for people. I'm not minimizing that. Overall, sort of from a macro perspective, the audience for indie games is bigger than it's ever been. They're more accepting of a wider range of things. You're still getting these incredible hits out of nowhere. Games like Balatro, kind of single developer or very, very small team. Content warning, like these games just appear out of nowhere, and they
Manor Lords.
Well, Manor Lords, yeah, absolutely.
That's our publisher.
Yeah. It's the potential is huge in indie games still, and I think that's a reason to be happy outside of the genuinely very challenging stuff that's going on in the industry.
Yeah, cool. Going into the second to last question, what is your definition of an artist? And it could be, again, this can be a super tough question. Could be a definition. You can really take it wherever your mind takes, because it doesn't have to be like a completely exhaustive description of the of the word.
Someone who is too annoying to have a proper job. I don't know.
Sounds about right.
I think it's someone who intentionally creates work that is for a type of consumption other than just utility. So it's anyone who is making stuff or work that has an aesthetic or a motive or non-utility basis, I think. I don't care about sort of whether that person is professional or whether what they're doing is in some kind of legitimized field or something like that. Like I think, I've a roundabout way of saying someone who creates art or someone who creates work that they are happy to have perceived on those terms. I'm not very prescriptive about any of this. I remember having had a pub argument with someone once about pop music can't be art, and that kind of question of sort of, if it's commercial, if it's made with a cynical motive, it can't be art. I don't agree with that at all. I think anything, a lot of it is just the output of the thing. It doesn't matter how you got to that output. It's there. You must have thought about this question a lot. What do you think?
I always dread this counter question. Well, I try and I think about it as I do about many things. I try and sort of collect different perspectives on it, because again, the simplest answer is that an artist is someone who makes art, and then I can just describe what art is, which is again difficult. But I do this is something. And again, people can have a lot of opinions of Jordan Peterson, but I do recommend people listen to some of his material, because he talks a lot about different philosophical topics and psychological topics, and he actually has a good bunch of older lectures and stuff on artistry, and I think there's a lot of stuff there that I haven't heard anywhere else. But he basically says, and I try and get this right, that artists are the civilizing agents of society. So they basically go into the unknown. They go beyond the known borders of reality. And they go in there and they make sense of something new, and they bring it back into the realm of the known. And this is how artists expand what we think of as reality, or think of as what the world is. And that's, if you think about any of the revolutionary things that art has done, that's exactly what it does. It transforms our perception of what reality is. So I sort of go back to that a lot, and I try and think about that a lot. So I would probably default into that answer.
I think that, not to disagree with Peterson by default, which I feel a strong desire to do, but I'm not going. It's not a default. The idea of civilizing, I think, is quite. I don't like that, because I think that civilizing is about establishing, a sort of structural control and normative control. And I think art is good at abstracting away from that and sort of saying, what are things that are outside of structure that might be more fundamental, or might be more, might provoke a sort of different perspective than what we perceive to be civilized. So that was my response to that. It feels more like something that can be a non-Petersonian hierarchy kind of inducing thing that takes you outside of those ideas, perhaps. But I don't know if that's just my reaction to his work in general.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously he's very different now than he was just a few years ago. I mean, he went through a lot of pressure. He had a lot of health issues, and I still think he's super solid in many ways, but he's sort of a bit more, become more edgier. Maybe it's because of all the attacks he's been getting. Maybe it's the, almost dying, or even worse than dying, what he went through with his health. But I love especially a lot of his older work, where he simply talks about philosophers and their discoveries, and how he relates that to psychology, because that's what he really understands the best. I think he's picked up on a lot of the works of Jung and Nietzsche, etc., and he's actually, I think, expanded quite a few of those points in a very useful way. But yeah, I would, and that's, I would encourage people to go and watch some of his older stuff, because it's a lot. It's super, super cool stuff. And I also did prefer his approach, before all the stuff happened to him, where he was a lot less edgier with his words. He wasn't as aggressive with them. But I suspect that's because he's under a lot of pressure and a lot of attacks. So I feel like it seems like he feels like he needs to fight more. But I did prefer him when he went down the route of minimal necessary force, because that's what, I mean, he came out on top the best way in that way, because he never basically attacked anybody. And I think that was Peterson at his best in terms of that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the philosophical, psychological stuff, older stuff, is super solid to check out. And kind of to your point, I think it depends on what you mean by civilizing, I guess, is quite essential in trying to solve that. I think I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I can even put this into words, but I think what he means is pulling something out of the substance of chaos into something that is that we can identify and put together in relation to all of us. I don't know how, at least I don't know if that's a horrible way of describing it, but it seemed like to me it was not about creating order and structure, but rather meaning pulling something into a form that we can understand and discuss, and something that elevates us to a better place. I think that's what he meant.
I mean, I think there's some interesting stuff in that Jungian idea of, there are these pre-existing kind of cultural forms that almost exist independently, and they reassert themselves in different ways. And I think that there's, I don't know sort of necessarily the implications of this, but I do think there are some fundamental underlying things that perhaps do transcend culture and the stuff that we've layered on top of our existence, that do seem to be relatively constant. But I also understand why some theorists think that is a problematic idea, and that you're by saying this type of perception of truth or love is fundamental, then you're imposing some standard on that. And so I have sort of sympathy for that stuff. I mean, it kind of gets hyper abstract at that point, and you kind of get to, well, what does that mean in reality? But I think that there is a sense of, one of the things that I like about music, and one of the reasons I like abstract forms is that they're not bound up with, like, you and I talking about someone like Jordan Peterson. The social impact that he's had, I personally find that to be quite deleterious, and I think that there some of his thinking has caused real social issues, and I feel like that's something that I might want to make as a point there. But secondary to that, I think one of the great things about art and the great thing about that kind of practice is that it doesn't have to interface with all of these individual issues and disagreements and political factors that are constant in everyone's mind. Of course it can engage with those, and a lot of art should engage with that and comes from that basis. But when something is more abstract, I think it can sometimes reach more people with different beliefs. Like I was saying to you before, I've always had friends who believe different things and who disagreed with each other, and I'm happy to say that my music reaches people with whom I disagree about a lot of things and people with whom I agree about a lot of things, and I think that's very valuable. The idea of it's in some ways naive, but kind of, can you create something that will make people find some common ground or some basis to have an experience together or more conversations together? I think that's really, really positive. And I think it's evidenced by, the way you and I are talking about these things, about some things that we may not agree with. Like, we've agreed a lot on things throughout our conversation, but having that base, I think that is so important. I think that's so, whether that is art or it can be sport or it can be other things that people find commonality in. The value of that is unbelievable and should really be protected, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's the thing that transcends all of this other, frankly, bullshit, but not that it's bullshit. Of course, these things are important, but yeah, it's the thing that transcends beyond all of it. And that's what allows us to, take a step back and see the bigger picture and see that as much as we might disagree, we still have far more in common. And I'd much rather focus on that rather than the minute things where we disagree about this or that. And also, this is why, there are a lot of great artists out there. And I think they can do their most powerful work at a society level by doing their art. And it's pretty evident once they start talking about political issues, etc., it's perhaps nowhere near as refined and useful as their music is. Not to say they shouldn't do that. Of course, everybody can say whatever they want, and I'm always a proponent of that. But they can do their best work through their art, I would say.
I think you've seen a lot of artists try and stray outside that, and with, as you say, mixed results, right? Like, and people have to express themselves. I think there is a difficulty in, if you have a platform that's based on your creative work, and then you're then using that platform in different ways. Again, can go right, can go wrong. It's about your intent is a huge part of that. Your sensitivity to how you're communicating is a huge part of that as well, and what your focus is. So absolutely, it's anyone who has any kind of presence wants to use that presence for a good purpose. I think social media has driven a lot of this. You have to comment on everything thing, which I think can be very difficult for people. It's good to see artists need to be engaged. I think there have been periods in history where they've really disengaged from what's been happening in the world, and that's not had great results at times. So it's it's the practicality of living in the world and trying to do good things and be a good person, as well as, but people a lot of the time are there for the music, not there for that. So there's no right answer to that one, definitely.
Yeah. And oftentimes it's the case that when a person sees success in one avenue of their life, they take that as a sign of
omnicompetence.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So it's like, well, if I'm seeing all this success, then everything I do and am must be the right thing to do. And they might not even think that very consciously, but if you do a bit of digging, you'll probably find that, maybe I'm doing this confirmation bias thing, and maybe I don't know so much about complex political or economic or whatever issue. So, but again, a remedy for that is to try and listen more than talk. Everybody's so eager to share their, half-baked perspective. And again, I'm a free speech absolutist. I think it's the only way we can sort out anything. But yeah, maybe I would presume, it's useful to assume that you should probably listen more than talk.
I think that's important. And I think kind of approaching things with openness and neutrality is important. And while, again, you have to stand up for things that you believe are important and state those things and not have that kind of modulated away by, what the group believes or all of that kind of thing. And music particularly, the music scenes being open to people who want to come in and want to perform or just want to be part of the audience has always been a really huge thing for me. And I think that kind of idea of kindness and generosity, of you might vehemently disagree with someone about something, you might see their belief as the worst thing ever, but are you approaching all of that with kindness and kindness towards other people? And it's always a person who's living a life. And of course, again, like this, I hear that the sort of social media voice, like as I say these things, would be like, but what about this specific situation? Like, and that's not, I don't think that's always the right way to think about things. I think it's just important to recognize just the humanity of other people. And I think things like music and games certainly have, been to games events which have been very welcoming, and some that have been less welcoming, for certain people. And you see that, and they have problems. But this idea that we do, it just comes back to commonality. I think that there are some common human experiences, and if you're, locked in a sort of ideologically positioned conflict with someone, just remembering their humanity and remembering that commonality is a big deal. Again, people will think that's oversimplistic. It is oversimplistic if you try and apply it to literally any event or any situation or any scenario. So,
I think that's very important, because one of the things you want to be conscious of is what is your aim, like genuinely, because one of the things, like one of the most powerful things is, even, let's say you and I disagree about something and we're in an argument. I need to ask myself, what is the way that both of us can come out of this in the best possible fashion, all things considered? And if you're authentically interested in all parties coming out of it in the best possible fashion, then you're, getting somewhere. But a lot of the time, people are far more bitter and resentful than they are willing to admit to themselves. And because of that, they want to win. And they want to, crush the enemy, and then everything is justified because you think you're right about your stance. So you like it's a big difference when you see somebody who understands this and somebody who hasn't incorporated that.
Trying to win arguments has been something I've struggled with, a lot in my life, and again, getting older, you really start to internalize that it's not about that. I still fall into that trap with friends sometimes, because I'm like, oh, we're friends, like they can deal with me being opinionated about this thing, and then you think, oh, maybe I'm just being, an idiot, and it's not good to ever have that position. But yeah, I think it's very true. Like getting beyond winning and to the well-being of the people involved in the conversation overall, I think is a huge mindset change for, you know, how you engage with things and how you engage with ideas. It's fine to criticize ideas, like vehemently criticize ideas and disagree with ideas, but ultimately it's, you know, yeah, what's the outcome? What's the consequences of that?
Yeah. And, you know, when you attack somebody, usually what happens is that they become defensive. And if you're with somebody who's defensive, it's very difficult to get your argument across, no matter how good you think it is. Well, they're now in a defensive stance, so good luck with that. You kind of screwed it up already. So yeah, that's why I think it's best to, you know, try and cultivate some kind of a different environment rather than like a attack defensive thing, and rather try and dissipate and try and find common ground and say, like, I'm not here to try and, you know, win or, you know, squash you or anything like that, but let's, you know, just try and get to a place where we can talk and have mutual respect as human beings, and hopefully something better can come out of that. Final question. If you could send a message to everyone's smartphone on the planet at the same time, it will hit the lock screen of their phone, so they have to look at it to unlock their phone. What would you send?
Don't look behind you.
That sounds very ominous. Like, I'm sure 100% of people would look behind them. It's like a threat. No, yeah, I find that pretty funny. But yeah, you mean like don't look back? You're not.
No, just that. I think that would be maximally annoying. I don't know. Or like low battery.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Fair enough. Cool. Well, it's been a pleasure getting to know you a bit. I appreciate the time you took to do no small slice out of your day. So thank you for that. And again, you're a fantastic artist and a really cool, nice person, apparently, as well. So that's a bonus.
Well, just to say, you know, thank you so much for this, and again for all of your very thoughtful words about my work and kind of what that's meant to you. It really is just the reason to do any of this is that you might, you know, reach another person in that way. So it's very validating, and thank you, and you know, thank you for having these thoughtful conversations. I think it's really, really important to keep doing that, and it's been lovely to just take this time to kind of reflect on things. It's been a really fantastic opportunity for me to do that. So loads of appreciation and thanks to you.
Cool. Thank you. That's very nice of you. All right. Cool. I think we'll end here, unless you want to touch on any parting words.
No, all good. Congratulations to anyone who's listened to this whole thing. Go and do some work. Thanks, man.
You're now inspired and motivated. Go do something. Cool. Awesome.
Right.
Nice chatting with you. I'll talk to you later.
Talk soon. Bye.